I'm Stuart Ramsey, the facilitator for the meeting. My colleagues, Peter Claghorn and Yvette Smith, and I got them working in the background to support us. So we'll be facilitating the meeting today. Next slide. So just a couple of things about the meetings, and I know most of you have seen this before, but for those of you that are new to the meeting or new to the stakeholder meetings, there's a couple of principles we try to ensure that we're following. Clearly, respectful dialogue. We've never had any issues with that with this group of stakeholders. It's always been a good conversation. Just a reminder for everybody that all questions and comments are public. It's a public meeting, so the record is public. So everything that we talk about together is public, including everybody will be able to see all of the questions and all of the answers, including those that are put into the chat or answered after the meeting. All of that will be public, so there's no secret conversations. So Santee Cooper has assembled I think the right group of people to be able to address any of the IRP related topics today. If you've got questions that aren't IRP related, I suggest that you find that we ask you to follow a different path for that. If you've got questions about tree trimming or things that aren't related to the integrated resource plan, we probably aren't going to have the right people to answer those questions today. A couple of you have asked, the email list that we have for you is not public. We aren't, as a matter of fact, Santee Cooper is only using that email information for IRP related communications. So that's they've placed a limit on what they're using your email information for, and it's just for the IRP. Next slide, please. So we got the Zoom webinar format going. We use this format. Our firm does a lot of facilitation for these meetings. We find this format is quite helpful. It allows good dialogue to take place. So what we would suggest is if you have questions, there's a couple of ways you can pose your questions. There's a Q&A button. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, I think for most of you it'll be the bottom. There's a Q&A box, so you can open the Q&A box and type your questions. Everybody can see those. We'll see them. Folks in the back room will work on getting the answers while the presenter continues the presentation. And the other option, of course, and John, I see that you've already raised your hand, is that you can raise your hand. And if you've got a question that you'd like to speak, rather than typing it into the chat box, the Q&A box, that's perfectly fine. We aren't using the chat feature, so that's been disabled. So with that, I'll just ask John. John, you've got a question. You feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. John Kramer, you should be able to unmute yourself. Well, I'll continue on, and John, if you've got a question, feel free to chime in or drop it into the chat box. So those are the best ways to interact. We invite you to ask questions, raise your hand if you want. The purpose of the meeting is to share information with you, be able to answer your questions, and get your feedback. So next slide. So what are we here today to accomplish? Well, there's been a lot going on between meeting 3 and meeting 4, IRA, elections, all sorts of things taking place. That's resulted in updates, or at least looking at the information and analysis that's been done to date to reflect on what changes, if any, may occur in things like load forecast and demand side management forecasts, etc. And so we've asked each of the leaders of each of those key areas to provide this group sort of an update on what, if anything, has changed as a result of the changes we've seen over the last several months. Next slide. So our speakers today are Greg McCormack. Greg's going to talk to us about load forecasting. Excuse me. We'll also hear from Jim Herndon on the demand side management forecast and market potential study. Nick Wintermantel will give us an update on impacts with solar integration, what we're seeing within the latest analysis. And then we'll hear a lot, hopefully, from Bob today on the balance, sort of pulling this together. What does this mean in terms of resource forecast, et cetera? And then with that, we'll sort of wrap up the meeting. So next slide. Just a couple of things. So we ask for feedback after every meeting, and we get feedback after every meeting, and we appreciate that. So what did we hear in terms of the feedback in the last from meeting number 3? Overall, the feedback was that the stakeholders saw them as valuable and worthwhile and worthy of the time commitment. There was a lot of satisfaction with the level of detail, the ability to provide input, and the balance between presentation and the ability to ask questions either through the Q&A or through raising your hands. We did get some feedback that the meetings were too long and sometimes too technical. And so we've tried to make some adjustments around that. We also heard that stakeholders were interested in assuring that there's continued access to proven reliable resources while Santee Cooper is transitioning to cleaner energy. Mitigating the reliance. So another concern was mitigating the risk of over-reliance on purchase power agreements, continuing to focus on reaching out to non-technical stakeholders. So we're trying very hard to make sure we're doing that. And then more detail about what is the impact of nuclear debt on the cost forecast. So that's probably not going to be discussed very much in these meetings. The cost of nuclear is the debt is the debt across all portfolios. So because it doesn't have a big impact on the difference in selections among the IRP resources, it's not something that's really going to be a big focus in any of these conversations. And so if that's an area of interest, we'd have to identify another meeting to discuss that. So what have we done? We've shortened the meeting length based on feedback, and we shifted the timing to the afternoon, focusing the discussion on impacts of new development. So we're trying to be fairly focused on the conversations, limiting the time frame, and doing it at a time where more of you said that you would be available. We're going to continue with our approach on balance of presentation and Q&A. And we ask that you speak up if it's excessively technical. I think our experts have recognized that they live and breathe this stuff. And so sometimes for them, it's just having a conversation about the stuff they're doing all day long. And not everybody understands everything that they're doing all day long. So you'll see me asking questions when I'm not sure what they're exactly what they're getting at, or exactly what the chart means. Please don't be shy about asking the same. Stands to reason if you're not sure what the chart means or what that point was getting to, then somebody else in the audience may have the same question or same concern. So here I'll pause, and then we have a question from Eddie Moore, and then we'll follow up with a question from Forrest. So Eddie.
Hi, thanks, Stuart. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
I see your summary that there's a lot of satisfaction with the process. And I feel like at this point, rather than just let that go unremarked, that, it has to be said that we have stakeholder meetings and then we submit comments, often seeking information, and the degree to which we get that information, we can't say in advance in the stakeholder meeting how satisfied we'll be afterwards. But the degree of transparency in the process that allows us to actually contribute meaningfully impacts the satisfaction a lot. And also, you mentioned some of the things that have happened in the interim between meetings. And there have been quite public indications that Santee Cooper is working together with Dominion and with the legislature to develop something that I would consider to be possibly the cornerstone of the IRP, which is the energy replacement for the retiring coal plants. And I raised this in the first meeting, and I raised it again after the last meeting. And since that time, there have been more and more indications that a core part of the IRP is essentially being hashed out somewhere else. And I'll say that I feel like it's irresponsible. I'm not trying to impugn your integrity. I think it's irresponsible not to mention it because it's such a high profile and important thing. And so I just want to say that the satisfaction with the stakeholder process could really be eroded if the core of the IRP is actually developed elsewhere. And in that regard, I'll say finally, we had yesterday's stakeholder process with Dominion, and that's part of where these indications are coming from.
Absolutely. Well, I understand. So Eddie, thank you very much for the feedback. And so we agree completely. And it's one of the reasons, if you look back at meeting number 1 and meeting number 2, this meeting actually wasn't in the schedule. And around the time we were heading into meeting number 3, Santee Cooper, Bob and the folks at Santee Cooper and Vanry, we were all looking at everything that was happening and said, there's a lot of new stuff emerging. We should probably plan on another meeting just to, I think initially it was the IRA that sort of had us all thinking, yeah, these impacts, could be significant, and even if they're not, we should be telling stakeholders what's happening. With respect to the discussion with Dominion, that was one of the conversations we had earlier with Santee Cooper. They said there's some conversations going with Dominion that we need to let the stakeholders know about. Nothing's been decided yet, but we're going to be jointly looking at some things, and so we should let them know that that's underway, so that they're not surprised when they see the results of whatever that analysis turns out to be, working its way in. So I absolutely appreciate the feedback. I think Santee Cooper is working hard to make sure that everything that is meaningful is provided to the stakeholders as early as possible. So, and if you have a view that that's not the case, then by all means let us know. But our intent is really no surprises. The stakeholders should be seeing everything as it comes together.
Well, not to put a point on it, I wouldn't be surprised if the outcome is a joint combined cycle plant, because that's exactly what people are saying. So it wouldn't be an issue of surprise or not being notified because I'm bringing it up because I'm aware of it. The issue would be whether the IRP actually comes out of a legitimate modeling analysis informed by stakeholder comment, or whether it comes out of a deal somewhere else.
Right. No, I understand that question, and I've got my view, having been, I'm an external party to this as a facilitator, and so I hear the conversations that Santee Cooper and its experts are having, and I believe that the decisions are going to emanate from the IRP. I believed Bob all along when he said, no, there's no, we don't have an answer that we're trying to divine. We want to see what the analysis shows us and move in that direction. But that's me. They're going to have to demonstrate that to the stakeholder satisfaction for sure. And so we're gonna be working hard to do that. And I appreciate your feedback. And if it looks like we're not accomplishing the goal of being transparent, by all means, keep speaking up. I appreciate this input, and I know they do as well. With that, Forrest, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. And my question is about kind of feedback and engagement from stakeholders. I feel like we've moved into the phase where that is the most valuable and important. There are some more detailed assumptions, methods, starting to be some results coming out, and this is where, for a stakeholder, it sort of shifts from a checkbox on stakeholder meetings to actual engagement. And so I guess I have a question related to that, because I do see, and you noted this just a moment ago, that that there's one more meeting after this, and on one of the later slides, it's labeled as final IRP results. So I want to make sure that there really is an opportunity for stakeholders to review detailed information that we can respond to, that we can provide recommendations related to, in time that the utility can incorporate the feedback into what it does with the IRP. Absolutely. So that's just kind of the setup, but the specific question, I guess, is when is the deadline for us to provide substantive recommendations, and when will we get the more detailed information that would serve as the basis that we would review and be able to respond to, for instance, related to the demand side management potential study, but there would be others as well. So
Sure.
that's kind of my main question.
Good. I think that's a wonderful question. And so we're going to hear from Bob later today. I'll ask Bob to sort of weigh in on what we think that timeline is looking like. It's just so you know, and I really do appreciate the question. It was probably 2 weeks ago that we my team and Santee Cooper and the Infront team spent about an hour just sort of working through that, having conversations about what that would look like, how much, when is it that the information becomes available to stakeholders, what's the timeline for them to have reasonable feedback. So we've been in that question and trying to make sure that we're managing the schedule accordingly. So it is something that I know Santee Cooper takes very seriously, and we've been trying to make sure that we're going to provide everybody ample opportunity to digest the information, run your own analysis if you want to, and provide meaningful input. So thank you for that. And again, so I'm not, with this slide here that's up in front of you, we're not trying to put words in the stakeholders' mouth. This is just a summary of the feedback that we've had from the stakeholders to date, and what we are doing in response to that. So we're trying very hard to listen and adapt as necessary to take care of the needs of the stakeholders. And we'll continue to ask for feedback and do our best to respond.
Stuart, hi. Good afternoon. This is Rahul. Stuart, you did a great job of tackling everything. I just wanted to step in and respond to Eddie's prior question. I just wanted to assure and confirm what you said, and that, hey, listen, what we are doing for a joint development, it's diligence. It's trying to understand the costs of the different options, but that is not going to. We'll still do a full IRP process, do sound analytics, and we'll be available. The information appropriate will be made available. We are just not there today. What we are doing is trying to do that diligence and make sure we have the appropriate costs and all the different options. So it's a lot of work to do. So we have to do it in parallel a little bit, but just like you said, Stuart, we will be transparent and make things available as they are, as we make progress. So I wanted to clear that up.
Thanks, Earl. I appreciate that. And I know that about your team, but I think it's helpful for you to be, telling the stakeholders that. So, okay. So just our agenda, we're going to discuss the IRP impacts on load forecasts. That'll be Greg. And then Jim will give us an update on where we stand with the demand side management market potential study. Nick will come in and give us an update on the solar integration study and what the results are looking like. We'll take a break around 2:45. We'll sort of play it by ear based on how the presentations are going and Q&A, but it'll be about then. And then we'll come back at 3 o'clock or thereabouts. And Bob will take us through the balance of the afternoon, discussing the major assumptions and what impacts we're seeing from the IRA and the IRA impacts that the previous speakers have discussed, and what's shaping up in terms of resource portfolios. And then I'll take it back and we'll close the meeting with any last questions or comments that anybody has. Okay, so why don't we, next slide, and I'll hand it over to Greg.
All right, thank you, Stuart. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg McCormick, Senior Manager of Financial Forecast. I was asked to speak to the potential impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act on our load forecast. Well, the act made some noteworthy changes to American policies. The direct impacts on our load forecast really are specifically related to credits for electric vehicles and solar. As a reminder, in session 2, we talked to you at length about these topics. So I just have a couple of slides today to sort of remind you what we did and what we talked about, and then just briefly how we expect these new credits might impact some of those projections. If you recall, for both of those cases, we created a high case, a base case, and a low case with the thought that we really wanted the high case to be very high and encompass a broad range of outcomes that might occur between the base and the high. And we did a similar concept with our low cases. So our high case was really intended to capture what's a very, very aggressive high case. So effectively, the question we were trying to answer for this was to validate that we don't see a reason why these new credits would create a scenario where our high case isn't high enough. We were pretty aggressive in developing our high cases. So I guess the shortcut answer to this question is that we don't really see a reason to change. And I'm going to talk through more why that would be. So the first slide, I'm going to talk through some of the specific credits of the act, and then I'll talk through the different forecasts for the electric vehicles and the solar. I also wanted to mention right off the bat that I'm assuming a lot of people on this call have a detailed knowledge of the act. So certainly if you think that we've missed a relevant part of the act, something that may impact our load forecast, please let us know and we will look at it closely and give you any sort of feedback that we might have on that. So jumping into the Inflation Reduction Act, so the electric vehicles and the rooftop solar, starting with the electric vehicle credits, really what happened was an adjustment to the credits that already existed before the act. The old credits were similar to the total amount of the new credit at the $7,500. It was $2,500 plus $417 per kW of capacity for the battery. And that credit phased out based on manufacturers once they sold over 200,000 vehicles. The new credit keeps that same $7,500 tax credit, but the qualifications are actually a little bit more onerous in my opinion. Really what they were doing is targeting domestic production, and you'll see some income and cost restrictions as well. So what you'll see is the final assembly of the vehicle needs to be in the US to receive the first half of the credit of the $7,500, and then the second half is based on the battery materials not being sourced from a foreign entity of concern. Also, the vehicles must now cost under a certain amount to receive the credit. So that's the $80,000 for trucks and the $55,000 for other. And then there are the income limits associated with the people purchasing the different credits. Again, the original credits didn't have these same limitations. So effectively, the positive change from this act that we would expect is to extend the credits for manufacturers who are making a lot of electric vehicles, the ones who have been sort of aggressive in their electric vehicle adoption and sales, and encouraging those manufacturers to continue making them. I think in theory, it could also expand the total number of cars available to receive the credit because there is no limit. But it also has the effect of sort of focusing the credit to a certain type of car and a certain type of buyer, unlike the previous credits. Moving over to the rooftop solar credits, they are, in my view, a little bit more potentially impactful because they extended the credit that was originally scheduled to sunset in 2024. Now it's 30% through 2032, steps down to 26% in 33, and then 22% in 34 before being phased out in 2035. So it just sort of extends that credit for a couple more years. And then the credit was expanded to include battery storage technology. So looking at the act, that is what we saw, and the impact potentially on electric vehicles and rooftop solar for credits. So circling back to the electric vehicle forecast, what we have on this slide, are the details really of our high case. So remember, what we were trying to do is make sure that these credits didn't potentially make it a situation where our high case isn't high enough. Just as a quick reminder before I talk about our high case, our base case used information from IRP, and their information, it tended to be somewhere in the middle of what we found when we looked at different projections for other groups. So, not the highest projection for our base case, but also not the lowest. We're currently about 0.5% of our customers have an electric vehicle. That base case projected that to be around 4% by 2029, and then growing to about 18% by 2021. Moving back to the high adoption case that we have shown here, we were aggressive in our assumption of trying to envision a scenario really where electric vehicles become the preferred automotive technology, basically replacing the combustion engine over time. To do that, we assumed the new CAFE standards from the Department of Transportation in 2026 cause an inflection point for electric vehicle adoption, where we have sort of this, not quite exponential, but a very large growth rate over a 10-year period, where by 2035, 80% of new vehicles sold are electric vehicles. And then I guess over time after 2035, you would just sort of normalize to that 80% mark. It leads to an extremely high growth rate on our system. You see the CAGR of about 26%. And by 2041, based on those assumptions, that 133,000 vehicles translates to about 40% of the customers at that time in 2041 would have an electric vehicle. So looking at this case and evaluating the credit, we feel strongly that it really won't create a step change in the electric vehicle adoption on our system, where we would need to adjust our high case. Circling back to the rooftop solar.
So Greg, when you're getting into the rooftop solar, John Brooker had asked a question, and hopefully you can address this, or maybe it falls into the next topic on the market potential study. Did the rooftop solar capture growth from nonprofit orgs with the new direct pay provisions, essentially a whole new sector? And is Santee Cooper looking to encourage this type of commercial solar through tariffs? Also, there are enhanced credits for community solar. Are these captured? So I said two there. It looks like three. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I think maybe the easiest way to address that would be for me to speak through this slide, and then we can circle back. Maybe I'll have you repeat that question. I can answer it at that time, Stuart, if that's okay.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And
so,
just sorry,
yes,
Greg, sorry to keep interrupting. And so I know several folks have asked questions that are related to energy efficiency. Actually, Jim and Patricia will probably cover a lot of that in the next section. I know folks in the back office are working on answering questions, but there's more about energy efficiency coming up in the conversation after Greg as well. So sorry, Greg, I just wanted to, I didn't want people sitting there wondering why their questions weren't being answered promptly.
okay, yeah, no problem. Speaking to the rooftop solar, so I mentioned we thought that the credit may have an impact because of the extension of the credit. So what we did was we took a much deeper look at the rooftop solar forecast to make sure that the existing cases were still appropriate. Just as a reminder, the high rooftop solar case responded to our low load case that we would provide for a low load forecast because solar reduces our load projections. And the way we projected this case, and really all of our other scenarios, was to use different information from the Energy Information Administration, or the EIA, and we use that to project growth on our system. So they provide information on what they expect solar adoption to be over time based on those different cases, and we're using that growth rate and applying it to our system. That's effectively how we're doing our rooftop solar projections. For the high case, again, we were trying to be very aggressive when we pulled together the high case. What we took was, at the time, the EIA's highest solar adoption, which was the low oil and gas supply case, which would naturally drive you to look to alternative measures. And we added a 50% growth on top of that. So we were trying to be sort of extra aggressive. We also, I guess, got a little bit lucky. Somebody in this group during one of our presentations recommended that we should look at battery storage. And so what we did in that high case is we basically said that every new customer that we put on our system puts on a 20 kW battery to be selectively dispatched. And so that high case already had a whole lot of Santee Cooper's customers, almost 100% by over time, with battery storage. And so the impact of giving battery storage credits doesn't really add any change to our high case. So that's why you'll see that we have no changes to our technology assumptions. So around the time of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Energy Information Administration released a new case that they called the Battery Storage Low Oil and Gas case. And so that case became their highest solar adoption case. So what we did is we took our model and we used that new information to develop what customers would look like under that new information. So that's the red line that you see on the graph. What you can see is it's certainly higher than our base case, but it's nowhere near as high as our extremely high or extremely aggressive high case. And based on that, we still feel comfortable that our existing case, both the base and the high being much higher, encompasses whatever potential impacts of the new act we might see. So that's what I have for my presentation. Stuart, if you want me to circle back and answer the question, I think the initial question was related to nonprofit solars potentially being incentivized.
I'll read them one at a time. Did the rooftop solar capture growth from nonprofit orgs with the new direct pay provisions, essentially a whole new sector?
Yeah, and so the way that we project our solar using this EIA information, it doesn't break down where the growth on the solar system is coming from. So it could be commercial, it could be residential, we have been sort of generic about that. So to the extent that the EIA is incorporating that new sector as a result of the IRA, and to be quite honest, the EIA case is not directly resulting from the IRA Act, but they just sort of happen to be at a similar time frame. To the extent that they've incorporated some of that into their analysis, we would be capturing it in ours as well. Okay.
And then is Santee Cooper looking to encourage this type of commercial solar through tariffs?
That's not really a question I can answer. That's not a load forecast question. So that's maybe better pushed to somebody more appropriate to handle.
All right. And then are there enhanced credits for community solar projects, and are those captured? Or sorry, I read it wrong. Also, there are enhanced credits for community solar projects, and are those captured, or are the impact of those captured?
So I think it would be the same answer as the first one, where to the extent that EIA is seeing these different pieces of the act or whatever increasing solar adoption, we would just naturally pick it up based on how we're projecting solar adoption.
Okay, great. And I know there's still some open questions about energy efficiency and the market potential study. And hopefully you'll hear the answers to those in the upcoming presentation. And if not, we'll make sure that those are answered. So thanks, Greg.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Great. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Jim and maybe Patricia. I thought it was just Jim, but I don't know. Maybe Patricia will be joining him to talk about the update on the demand side management projections. So Jim. Oh, hey, there is Patricia. Good to see you.
Stuart, can you hear me?
I can. Good to see you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. You too. Okay, well, so we'll continue on from the solar discussion into the energy efficiency demand response discussion. And so if we can move to the first slide. So I wanted to just kind of review what you had heard in the previous 3 meetings, and then if there's something that we need to talk about ahead of time, Stuart, I'll just rely on you to tell me when you'd like for me to switch over and talk about that.
Good.
Okay, so this is just a real short review about where we talked through about where we were coming from 2019 when we established what we're calling our 2030 goal, and that we had developed a 2019 energy efficiency market potential study, and that study used the total resource cost plan. Now, there's 2 important points that I wanted to point out. The first was that the results from this study were taken through the additional step of bundling measures such that they integrated well into our existing energy efficiency programs. We've been running a portfolio of very strong energy efficiency programs since 2009. And so there were some additional measures that were identified that we could add on to these existing programs, and it gave our residential and commercial customers more options for energy efficiency measures. Secondly, we used the total resource cost test as a screening mechanism. This considered the customer's incremental cost for the energy efficiency measure, the available tax credits for the energy efficiency option, and Santee Cooper's avoided supply cost and cost of program admin for these programs. And so what we saw, our historical incremental annual energy savings from these programs as a percent of retail megawatt hour consumption ranged from 0.35% to 0.91%. And so this was during the time frame of 2013 through 2017. One of the things that was pushing that was our commercial trade ally network became fully aware and engaged in the opportunity to switch out T12 fluorescent tubes for the much less energy consuming T8 fluorescent tubes. And our commercial market, and in the retail sector, we serve the Myrtle Beach area. Everybody thinks about how much fluorescent lighting you see there in that marketplace. And so it had largely been untapped. So the T12 to T8 gave us these incremental savings, and we really peaked in 2017 because we had tapped into such a large share of that market. And so then we go to, we said, okay, we got to move past this for this IRP. And so let's take what we had done in 2019, that study before we knew that we were going to be submitting as a part of an IRP, and let's at least do a comparison to know take the same 2019 energy efficiency study and do the TRC compared to the utility cost test. And so what does that mean is that we were used all the same assumptions, but we were using the UCT utility cost test as the screening mechanism. And so the utility cost test included the incentives paid by the utility to the customers, but it did not consider the customer's incremental cost of the next most energy efficient measure, and it didn't consider the tax credits available to the customer either. So in general, in our mid-tier case, we saw cumulatively over the 10-year period, by the 10th year, we were about 10 gigawatt hours different. So he said, okay. So we then went back to looking at what we needed to do next for a market potential study with regards to energy efficiency. And we'll discuss that in our next slide. But the last part you'll see is currently working toward 35 megawatts of dispatchable demand response capability by 2027 and 44 megawatts by 2035. Santee Cooper hasn't done a demand response program in a number of years. And so we are working with a very innovative type of switch that we've got some trade secret patented information in, as well as we went ahead and had the DERM system, the distributed energy resource management system, be the controlling feature for even these switches so that we can expand that program as time goes on. Next slide, please. Okay, so I told you that we recognize that our 2019 energy efficiency market potential study was stale because it wasn't, we stood back and we looked at it and we said that while we did that study was a very different, had a very different purpose than where we were today. So we started all over again. So we now have to consider how this market potential study for energy efficiency needs to have a larger perspective. From the time we did the 2019 study until now, we know that market conditions have changed. Time, of course, has affected what the base assumptions needed to be. So we had resource innovations start all over again from scratch. So we had them look at to put in as their base assumptions what was in the 2022 load forecast. Overall, that wasn't huge shifts, but what we did see were large differentials in the cost of avoided capacity and energy cost estimates. So you'll see the results of that Jim will talk about in a minute. Also, there were some additional energy efficiency measures were included that were not available at the time that we did the 2019 study. So those were added, and then we only use the utility cost test to screen these energy efficiency measures. And then Jim will be presenting those results in just a minute, but we think you'll like the end product from that updated, refreshed market potential study.
So
And
Patricia,
then, I'm sorry.
yeah, one of the questions from John Brooker was, has the MPS been made available? I think the answer is no, because it's not done yet, but so has it been made available? And if not, will it be made available?
The results that you'll see today are straight out of the model as of a week ago. And so the measure list is going to be made available almost immediately, but then the report will follow that. There's another aspect to that because we're using the same set of resources at Resource Innovations, where, let's go to the next bullet and I'll circle back around, Stuart, if that's okay, is
Perfect.
that we've asked Resource Innovations. I have not been able to find anyone with any knowledge of us ever having done a demand response market potential study. So we, instead of having Resource Innovations put together the final report for the energy efficiency MPS, we had them immediately start the demand response market potential study. And this will inform us of where we get the 35 megawatt potential by customer segment. And so we're looking to have the demand response market potential study, the initial results ready by the beginning of February 2023. And so answering back, we'll get the finished report from energy efficiency demand market potential study completed after we get the initial results and then the QC results from the demand response market potential study, and all that will be made available.
Okay,
But
thank you.
we're just having to do it consecutively rather than a lot of things in parallel because of resource constraints. And then the last point that we'll talk about is the information that we received from Central, just to speak about their 2020 IRP filing. And so unless there are other questions that we want to discuss live, then we'll turn it over to Jim Herndon.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are still some open questions, but I think they're in the material that Jim's going to be discussing. So I'll sort of ask them at the right time. So Forrest, Chris, Eddie, I know several of you still have open questions. I'll just pitch those to Jim at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Patricia. So I'm, as Patricia said, we have been working through overall DSM market potential study. The first phase was focusing on the energy efficiency piece, and now we're just getting to the demand response piece. So I was gonna, for today, cover a snapshot of where we are. Yeah, these results are pretty hot off the press. So no final results yet, but we did want to share, like I said, where we are and some draft results that we have so far. But just to maybe restate or expand a bit on what Patricia introduced, Santee Cooper, it was decided that a new market potential study was the best course of action. I think some of that was based on some changes in forecasting and energy costs, as well as even some feedback from the stakeholder group, to maybe just, rather than trying to adapt a potential study that was a few years old, to actually pull in and start over with a brand new study. That did allow us to incorporate all the current forecasts, current energy costs, update our measure list to be consistent with currently available energy efficiency measures that we're using in other current studies. And as Patricia mentioned, also to focus and from the get-go to focus on the UCT perspective for economic screening. And so with all that said, I mean, the primary focus for this study was estimating achievable potential to develop scenarios specifically for Santee Cooper's integrated resource plan, as far for what DSM opportunities may be available in Santee Cooper's retail service territory. The figure on the right here shows the typical steps in a market potential study. And so you start with technical potential, kind of looking at every energy efficiency technology that's out there and available without really worrying about costs or economics. From there, you do look at economics. And like I said, in this case, we looked at what passed the utility cost test, which does compare the utility avoided cost, avoided energy, avoided capacity cost with the utility cost of offering a program. And that'd be the cost of the rebates or incentives offered, as well as operational costs to administer the program. So both of those are on the cost side, but it truly is from the utility perspective. And then after you do the economic screening, the next step is to look at achievable. What will the market bear based on the offer by the utility, based on the type of measure, the incremental cost, the incentive or rebate offer, that not everyone's going to take that offer up, but then achievable potential. And that's the focus for the integrated resource planning scenarios. From there, typically DSM potential goes through another step where you fit the measures that passed into bundles or programs that would make sense for utility to offer. In some cases, not all measures might make it into a program. It might be some choices. There might be some overlap of measures or some upfront costs that just doesn't necessarily make sense for a utility to offer all at once. So it could be a phased approach, but typically there are some considerations around or additional considerations as you go from achievable to program. But for the analysis we were doing so far for this IRP, it was really focused on achievable potential.
So Jim, just, the three of the open questions are really related to, does your analysis take into consideration the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act? And so I'll just paraphrase a couple of them, so these are from Forrest, Chris, and Eddie. Forrest says, in addition to EV and solar, what about IRA impacts, load impacts on customer uptake of energy efficiency? Chris's question is, why do you expect no impact on load from the Inflation Reduction Act's investment in energy efficiency and other demand side management? And Eddie's question, all sort of same locus. The IRA provides significant new tax credits for efficient HVAC plus multi-billion-dollar programs with rebates up to $14,000 per home for efficiency and electrification. So there's major energy efficiency component in addition to EVs and PVs. So I guess the short question is, I know you sort of started again from scratch. Is all of that sort of IRA impact taken into consideration in your analysis? Or can you talk about how it is?
Yeah. So, and actually the next slide. So it's actually a good segue to the next slide. So I would say that,
I try.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Actually, should probably thank Eddie and Forrest too, for asking questions that tease some of the discussion. So yeah, so I definitely was, seeing those questions on IRA, I was going to mention that. I mean, I would say that obviously everyone's been furiously reading the IRA and trying to figure out the impacts. We are trying to incorporate, as we understand, impacts overall on or the energy efficiency components of the IRA. Like I think Eddie mentioned, the rebates available for some individual, heat pumps, building envelope type things, as well as some of the more packaged, targeted percent savings in homes, things like that. So we definitely looked to see or confirm that those measures are included in our measure list. And I think we did just distribute the measure list for the study. So look to see that those are in there. And then as well as I get into this slide, I think there's implications of the IRA that, as I mentioned on the last slide, that red box was around achievable potential. And we were somewhat intentional in determining potential more based on achievable potential here due to those kind of things, right? We weren't trying to limit it to, existing Santee Cooper programs or programs only offered by Santee Cooper. Really what we looked at was more market-based potential, which is described on this slide, to say, well, let's look at the cost of a technology and what's the available offset or rebate, upfront cost, customer payback, those kind of things. So it doesn't really matter if it's coming from a utility sponsored program or funds from an IRA or the IRA, or what the funding source is. It really just looks at the economics. So maybe just to talk through this slide. So I guess that's the quick answer. And maybe I'll talk through this slide and come back to that if that sounds okay or works for everybody.
Yeah, but I just want to put a point on it. And that all made sense to me. And you are aware of what's now available from the IRA, and that's influencing how much would fall into the potential bucket. Did I get that right?
Well, I would say the things in the IRA, right, are things like rebate. Like I think Eddie, I think in a question mentioned up to $14,000 available, right? That would offset the cost of a 18C or 20C or heat pump, that kind of thing. So our potential study is market-based. So it looks at, okay, well, that heat pump costs a certain amount above a standard heat pump. And if there's an incentive of 25% of that covered, or 50% or 75% covered, what is the adoption rate? So it doesn't really matter where that funding is coming from to cover that 50% or 75%. So from that perspective, I think things like the IRA that are additional funding sources, maybe outside of a Santee Cooper sponsored program or sponsored rebate, that's where it would get those kind of things do get incorporated, because this is an economic analysis.
Okay, good.
Sorry, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit on a few things here, but I did want to, but I do think there is a tie-in, since there were some questions on the IRA. So hopefully that helps answer some questions, because the idea of this market-based achievable potential, and I think for some of the folks on the call that have been maybe in some other stakeholder forums, we have described this approach, because this is an updated approach that we are applying for some other utilities in the region, that tries to look more at market response to energy efficiency, and the additional cost versus the energy savings benefits. So we do consider it to be market-based, not specifically tied to a particular type of utility program, but more focused on customer adoption of the individual measures that pass the UCT, that pass that economic screening, and how those would get adopted in the market. And we call it market-based because it does assume that those EE measures follow patterns of a typical market, so that customers are making decisions for buying EE products like they would for other goods or products that they buy, that there's trade-offs in how much they're willing to spend or wanting to spend versus the benefits they're getting. And it does assume that there's minimal or no kind of informational or awareness barriers. So that's been a challenge with energy efficiency, is in the past that not all customers are aware, understand the technologies. So this market-based assumption assumes that there's not those types of major informational barriers, because there are utility programs, because there's the IRA, because there's Energy Star out there that's helping customers learn about this. So it informs them at least to the costs and benefits, and they're able to make more of an economic decision around the choices on adopting energy efficiency or not.
Okay, so Jim, for us as a follow-up question, I think I know the answer, but I think it's a great question, because when I saw it, I'm like, okay, let me make sure. So it said, does this mean that the MPS results in the next slides include both utility administered EE and also naturally occurring combined? Just clarifying, since MPS studies, especially in an IRP, are typically distinct to utility administered savings, and naturally occurring EE is separately identified. So can you talk about how those two fit into your results?
Yes, that's a good question for us, and it's kind of in the nuance or the details of the study. I mean, I would say that we would categorize it. So it's everything we're doing. I mean, I think it actually ties back to the load forecast, right? That there's not been an adjustment, or it's still aligned with the load forecast, right? That there was not necessarily an EE or DSM adjustment to the load forecast. So that what we try to capture with market potential or doing these types of studies is additional energy efficiency opportunities outside of what's already in the load forecast. So what's going to happen in the market? So there's a utility load forecast that does already estimate some amount of energy efficiency is going to naturally occur. And then our studies look at what energy efficiency opportunities with, say a 30% incentive or a 50% incentive or 75% incentives, what energy efficiency would occur on top of that, right? So in addition to the load forecast, or how would the energy efficiency under those scenarios impact the load forecast? So I don't know that I'd quantify what we're capturing as naturally occurring, but like I said, it's not tied to a specific Santee Cooper program. So it's a little more broad than and maybe some of it is things Santee Cooper could capture. Yeah, I guess it kind of varies, or maybe it's down into the details of what technology we're talking about, or what EE measure we're talking about. But the idea is that it's achievable potential beyond Santee Cooper's baseline load forecast.
Okay,
So
good.
Hopefully that answers the question.
We're not missing opportunities that have now become available through enhanced funding from the IRA.
Right, and I think that's a potential outcome of the IRA. I think there's still a lot to be figured out on the IRA. This is outside the study, so but it could, in theory, if there's these available incentives from other sources, then maybe there's maybe there's different ways utilities would try to influence the EE market. But I think that's still to be determined.
So then the follow-up to that is, so how does this relate to determination of Santee Cooper's EE resource investment related to IRP? I'm perplexed. So so
I'm not helping for us, I'm hurting. Well, I think that's still to be determined, right? I think right now what we're assessing is the potential under 3 scenarios that's feeding into an integrated resource plan. So I think that to me, and again, I'm on the outside on this, but I guess that's my perspective, is that's still to be determined, right? We're just trying to lay out what those scenarios are for different levels of investment in energy efficiency and the different opportunities for those different levels of investment.
Right, and then that leads right into Chris's follow-up. He says, so will the load forecast be adjusted based on MPS? I'm confused why the load forecast would not reflect more people undertaking EE measures and therefore reducing load. And I think that's what you all are working out right now, is how much of it shows up in the load forecast as a result of naturally occurring or things outside of Santee Cooper programs, and how much is showing up as a result of Santee Cooper programs. I mean, that's what did I get that right? Or have I missed it?
Right. I mean, well, everything we do, we try to be very deliberate in what's being assumed for the load forecast. So where the load forecast assumes that over time, lighting is becoming naturally more efficient, or the SEER ratings, because of codes and standards and other things naturally change over time. And that's captured in the load forecast. So what we do in our studies is try to understand, in addition to what's already being assumed there, if there is an offset or a incentive or a rebate, things like that, what could influence the market to go beyond what's already in the load forecast. So I think, but yeah, I mean, the idea is that we're doing this DSM potential study to feed into the IRP and the load forecast that gets included there. So I think that's the premise of why we're estimating these scenarios.
Great, thank you.
Okay, hopefully that helps. Hopefully I'm lessening the questions rather than adding to them. So anyway, but yeah, so I don't know if there's any more detail needed on this, but the idea, like I said, is that this is, oh, sorry, I didn't really finish this slide, but yeah, so we based this on a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab study on Energy Star appliances that looked at how, over time, how customers have adopted efficient appliances and how incremental cost has affected that versus how the energy savings benefits affected that. So we've really been focused on finding quantifiable sources for how to estimate customer adoption when they're, to look at those trade-offs of additional cost versus that energy savings benefit, where customers are having to make those choices. And like I said, and then what we did was take that Energy Star appliance study and we've applied it more broadly across other EE measures. So this is a bit more of a optimistic, I think, perspective, in that whereas Energy Star is a pretty well established brand, and so there is probably more brand awareness of that than maybe some of especially the newer EE measures. But we did go ahead and make that decision that other EE opportunities would, or customers would respond to those similarly to this Energy Star appliances in terms of their uptake based on that incremental cost and or additional cost and payback and things like that. And again, without the presence or with minimal influence of those market barriers around understanding or just awareness, but recognizing that what it would take for customers to go beyond the status quo or go beyond that just code baseline level. So that's the idea. So that's why I say it's a little bit more broad than just focusing on what can be attained through a particular program. That might be a little more limited. So that's the idea of where this is more of a market-based approach.
Okay, good.
So you can go to the next slide. And I've kind of touched, I think I've talked through these or referenced them at least. We did look at 3 achievable scenarios. The low scenario was intended to align with the level of incentives that's currently offered by Santee Cooper, which averages around 25 or 30% of the incremental cost, with roughly comparable program administrative costs for the programs. We did screen measures with a utility cost test threshold of 1.0, which means benefits would have to be equal to or greater than the costs. So it's benefits divided by costs. So as long as the benefits equal them or greater, then the measure is included. And like I say, the market potential is based on what I described in the prior slide, looking at those adoption assumptions around incremental cost and savings benefits. So that's the low scenario. The medium scenario, we did look at a higher incentive rate. So bump that up to assuming that 50% of the incentive cost is covered through incremental cost is covered through an incentive or a rebate. from a UCT perspective, though, however, that actually adds cost to that benefit cost ratio. So you have the same benefit, but you have some additional cost because you've increased how much the utility, in this case, will be paying in incentives. And so kind of to counteract that, and also to kind of think of things more from a program or portfolio level, we did lower the screening threshold to a 0.7. So that means that the benefits only have to be 70% of the costs in order for that measure to pass. So we did relax that a bit to account for that. Well, yeah, there is some additional cost on the incremental cost, but trying to stay, like I said, a little more aggressive in what measures get included, and think of things more from a broader perspective. And then the high scenario, we actually bumped up the incentives even more to 75% of the incremental cost. And for this scenario, we also increased the avoided marginal energy costs. Like it says here, as a sensitivity, anticipating that there, if there's a higher fuel costs, maybe than the current forecast, or if there's any kind of carbon costs or other types of things that would contribute on the benefit side, we did include that increase on the avoided energy to add to the benefit side, again, where the higher incentive adds a little bit on the cost side. And we did include the 0.7 UCT for the high case as well, just to try to, like I say, kind of look at things from a broader perspective. So again, the 30, 50, 75% were the incentive thresholds, and whether that's specifically offered from Santee Cooper, or if that's offset from some other something else like the IRA. I think the idea is that the adoption is based on how does that offset that upfront cost to customers, and look at adoption based on that payback inclusive of having that incentive or that buy down of that initial cost.
So Jonathan, Lee has a couple of questions on page 18 or slide 18. Does the medium scenario of the achievable potential EE scenarios reflect a base case assumption that Santee Cooper will increase its program incentives?
I think generally, yes. I mean, the 50% incentive rate is higher than the average incentive rate than Santee Cooper currently offers. So yeah, I mean, the average incentive would be, we're now, and not every incentive is the same. It's hard to do these measure by measure with the exact incentive amounts, but generally, yes, it does assume a higher incentive than what's currently offered on average and what's offered in Santee Cooper's programs.
Okay, great.
I see the questions are coming in
Yeah,
faster, so I keep generating more.
Well, it's what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So I'll take Jonathan's follow-up. So does the UCT of 0.7 necessarily indicate that these measures may be uneconomic relative to a new generation source?
Let me think about that one. It's avoided cost benefit relative to the program cost from a UCT. Well, I think it's hard to make that direct comparison using the UCT test. I think usually you use something like levelized cost. So it's, what the premise is, or the idea is, you're going to have some measures that would have still have a UCT higher than 1.0. And so you would offset it more. So from, like I said, from a program perspective or a portfolio perspective, you would still be above a 1 on the UCT. But I think, and I apologize, I'm thinking on the fly here, I don't know that UCT is the right metric to compare to supply side.
Okay, well, maybe we can get somebody else to take a look at that.
Yeah,
Okay,
and I
well,
have to think through that a little more.
I'm mindful. I don't want to, one of the challenges of facilitation is to try to stay to the agenda and also make sure everybody's questions are getting answered. So I think let's keep going. I know there's a
Move
couple
on. Okay.
questions, and I'll ask the team in the back office to work on those.
Okay, well, we're quickly coming to some results here, I think. So
Sure.
we can move on to the next slide.
Which I think are going to cause more questions, which is good.
Probably. So yeah, and I know, I think we're running a little behind, but to quickly describe what's shown here, this is the annual incremental energy savings for the 3 scenarios, for the low, medium, and high. So what each of these bars represents is the savings from customer participation or measure installations in that particular year. So there's no carryover effect or cumulative effect in this. This would be annual participation is shown here, and it's shown as a % of retail sales. Like I said, for the 3 scenarios. So again, and this is based on what passes the UCT, and so everything that passes the UCT is feeding into this. So as we get to program potential or program planning, that would, if different measures or different incentive rates are used, that would obviously affect the total numbers. But this is based on all the measures that pass UCT and their achievable potential.
Super.
Okay, so that's incremental. The next slide has cumulative. So as opposed to incremental, the cumulative represents the savings that are occurring in a particular year from the measures installed in that year and the ones that were previously installed that are still saving energy. So, a heat pump that was installed in 2023 has a 12-year measure life. It's contributing 2023 all the way, or actually all the way through this. This is a 10-year look. So it would, so every, all the heat pumps that get efficient heat pumps that get installed throughout the life are all contributing ultimately to that 2032 market potential. So that's the difference in incremental and cumulative. So this reflects that accumulation of savings over the full study period. So that's it on the EE side. So those are, and again, these are pretty hot off the press draft results. So obviously we're formulating those with more and adding more detail, and we'll generate a report on that. But that's kind of, we did want to share with where we are right now. So like I said, that's what we have on EE. If you get the next slide, so demand response. And I know we're running short on time. I don't know if we need to talk through everything.
Just go ahead and
okay.
Yeah, it's a topic that everybody's interested in.
Okay.
Let's not shortchange it.
Okay, we'll do. So as Patricia mentioned, Santee Cooper was interested in doing a demand response market potential study. So that's kind of the second phase of our overall DSM potential study, looking at loads that are available for control or curtailment during system peak periods. We are looking at both summer peak and winter peak. And so for demand response, the way we typically look at it is looking at 3 different customer segments. We look at residential customers, look at small and medium business, and look at large commercial. And for residential and small and medium businesses, we really focus on loads that can be controlled, because those kind of customers are more, it's typically more aligned with load control type opportunities. And then large commercial is more just around, or focused more on curtailment. The customers will have the ability to curtail their load either voluntarily or contractually based on an economic offer. So residential and small and medium businesses is more focused on end uses, looking at what load is available to be controlled from air conditioning or pool pumps in the summer, or space heating in the winter. So depending on which season, then there's different end uses to be controlled. And then the large commercial, it's more just overall customers are willing, for the right incentive or right economic offer, are willing to do some type of curtailment. You go to the next slide. And you can probably just click all the way through these. So this is an example of what we do for the analysis of residential or small and medium business to get the air conditioning load. Is we do get interval data. So that's what we've just recently received from Santee Cooper, is interval data, which is a big data set. So we're wading through that at the moment. But look at interval data to create a load shape for peak day. And this is an example of one for residential customers. So the blue line would be their total load shape, showing that late afternoon peak on a summer day.
So this is just illustrative, right?
This is illustrative. Yeah, this is not Santee Cooper data. This is just an example, but I would assume that theirs is going to look similar. But showing, total load increasing on a summer afternoon, and then disaggregating the cooling portion of that load from the other uses, or the base portion of that load. So we use climate data to come up with an estimate of what that cooling load is, and where that orange arrow is, that would be the load that's available for curtailment during that peak hour. So whether it's a thermostat or a switch or somehow to control that or cycle off their cooling load of their total load, that's what we look at for that peak hour, of what load is available to be controlled or curtailed. So that's the example of what we do for residential and small commercial. Then the next slide, we show a few load shapes, I think, for large commercial. So like I said, we don't really focus as much on end uses for large commercial, but we do look at different facility types. So for the large commercial, we do break out that interval load data by customer type, because we have data from around the country on demand response, participation rates based on different offers from different industries. Some industries are a little more willing or a little more flexible in terms of curtailment than others. You have some that are more like hospitals and things like that, have less ability or have more functions that they're not able to curtail versus some other industries. So we do it by facility type, looking at both summer and winter, and leveraging data from other demand response studies in terms of if there's this type of economic offer, this portion of the market and this portion of their load could be captured through achievable curtailment. Oh, and I should mention, sorry, I was rushing a little bit. We are going to look at 3 scenarios of achievable for demand response, similar to energy efficiency. So we will look at a low, a medium, and a high achievable for demand response, similar to what we're doing for energy efficiency. So maybe I'll pause there, but otherwise, with that, I'll turn it back over to Patricia.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So there's one other aspect of the DSM that involves central cooperatives and their cooperatives. And so we did, can we go to the next slide? We did have conversations with Central, and in accordance with Act 62, Central is required to submit an IRP every 3 years to the South Carolina Energy Office. And Central did that in 2020. And they completed some studies and submitted that to the Energy Office. And within that IRP, Central evaluated a DSM with high, medium, and low scenarios. And so Central, when they're doing a low, medium, and a high scenario, they do consider that the co-ops themselves, they're autonomous, and they will make decisions about which DSM programs that they will participate in. And so the Central's DSM programs are typically targeted toward direct load control and energy efficiency to a very, very limited perspective. And so to see the details of that, you can access Central's IRP by going to this link right here. And they do a really good job of spelling out all the considerations within their structure and how they looked at things from a financial perspective as to how it may best serve their co-ops. So, but I encourage you to look at that IRP and just see some of the innovation that the co-ops are pursuing. And we appreciate your time and attention to the DSM subject area. It is a area with a lot of change going on in general, and then because of technology, but now because of the IRA, that all the different acronyms that have come down from the different funding sources. So we appreciate your time and interest.
I know you and your team have been pretty excited about a lot of what it can do. It's been fun to watch. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I guess we'll ask, thanks, Patricia. And I guess why don't we go ahead to the next slide and ask Nick to join us to give us an update on the solar integration. And I know we're running a little long. I think that's okay. I'm sure we can make it up a little later, maybe shorten the break a little bit. So Nick, don't feel like you've got to speed read your way through this.
Yeah, no, thanks, Stuart. I'll try to be fluid and not be long-winded, but I do have some slides here. Appreciate the opportunity. Mr. Ape has been working on a solar integration study for Santee Cooper over the last couple of months. I know I presented kind of our methodology back in one of the meetings, so I'm here to kind of present the results as they are today. They're not, officially final. I think we're still doing some review internally, both Santee Cooper and Estrompe, but it is kind of the results as they are today. We can go to the next slide. A couple of these early slides just kind of set up the study. We talked a little bit about this.
Nick, could you just speak up just a little bit?
Yeah, check my volume here. See if
That's better.
that's already better.
Oh yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I just need to get a little closer to the mic. So the framework that was used, we think we talked about this in an earlier meeting this year, is we basically took the planning reserve margin study within SERVM, used the same framework with the number of weather years, the load forecast error uncertainty, the unit performance. The couple changes that we make when we go to this integration study is we actually dispatch the system at 5-minute increments, so we can kind of understand the flexibility of the system and understand how the system can meet net load on a 5-minute basis. The other piece is because we are going to 5-minute dispatch, we have to simplify the model a little bit, in that we model Santee Cooper as an island, but we model some market capacity to try to represent what could be captured in the market. And we get the system back to 0.1 LOLE. So we're looking at a broad number of simulations across weather years to understand the integration of solar and any costs associated with it. Again, our base case is 2029. We looked at several scenarios. We looked at kind of an existing fleet case of 2026, among some other sensitivities, which I will get into. Next slide. A little bit more about the model. The model is a 8760 hourly chronological commitment and dispatch model, but we do simulate at that 5-minute dispatch level. Kind of a change from the reserve margin to this study is we also need to focus in on the resources on the Santee Cooper system and make sure we're capturing all their constraints correctly, kind of in a more detailed fashion. So we're modeling full heat rate curves, min up, min down times, ramp rates, any type of must run designations. So all that's been incorporated, working closely with Santee Cooper on their fleet to really understand these constraints. And the model is going to respect those constraints as it tries to meet net load every 5 minutes. And the other piece of the change is the fact that the model does not have perfect knowledge of net load hour ahead. It really doesn't have perfect foresight until the next 5 minutes. So it does know I have to meet this next 5-minute net load. But we introduce some uncertainty around solar and load as we commit the resources to try to represent real-time operations. And you also have uncertainty around generator outages. The model, as it commits, doesn't know which generators are going to fail. So we're trying to create this realistic look at what operators are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis as we integrate solar. Next slide. Real quick, just definition of operating reserves, at least as they're input into SERVM. You can see this throughout the industry, lots of different ways to name different types of operating reserves, but within SERVM, we have a reg up, reg down, which again is kind of a 10-minute ramping capability of the system, but it can only be served by units who have AGC capability. And we have two other categories that are also online reserves, spinning reserves and load following reserves. They're essentially identical, but they're served by units who have minimum load less than their maximum, so they just have the ability to ramp. And so if they're online, they can serve spinning and load following. And then quick start are kind of your non-spin, traditionally called non-spin reserves. So they're your quick start reserves that can come on in 15 minutes or less. And so SERVM is going to commit resources to load plus some level of operating reserves or ancillary services. I noticed in the presentation today, as I was going through it, we kind of interchange the terms ancillary services and operating reserves. We see those as the same term. Next slide. This is just an example of kind of the different reliability metrics that we're trying to see in our study. Traditional LOLE, we call LOLE cap capacity. That's what we really examined in the planning reserve margin study. We're trying to determine how much installed capacity do I need on my system. And of course, the example here just shows you're at a peak period. you get to a situation where you have lots of generators offline, extreme peak loads, and we just can't meet load. So that is traditional LOLE used for reserve margin planning and ELCC analysis. For integration analysis, if we jump to the next slide, we're also capturing periods where we couldn't meet net load, but on a 5-minute basis. But the violation for this instance only occurs when we actually had additional installed capacity on the system. We may have had enough on the system, but we just couldn't ramp fast enough to meet a 5-minute net load. So it's not a reserve margin problem. It's a problem really that we didn't commit enough resources on my system to give us that headroom to follow fast variations in net load. My example here kind of shows what Servam would see. Servam gets the forecast of what net load would look like. So it sees kind of this smooth blue line, if you will. But when we actually simulate, we're going to introduce this volatility or this uncertainty around net load. And what Servam's going to actually have to go meet on a 5-minute basis is this red line. And so if we don't have enough ramping capability on my system, say it's 12:05 here, and we get this ramp up, there may be in a position where we didn't have enough online, enough ramping capability in our system to completely meet net load. Now, real world reality, it's probably not a firm load shed event. You have ACE deviations because Santee Cooper is interconnected with its neighbors. You'll see ACE deviations. And so that's probably really what this is more measuring. There's really no way to measure true ACE deviations in a model like Servam or really for any model that we're really aware of for integration studies. But this kind of correlates well with ACE deviations. If we see these flexibility violations creep up, that means that we're probably increasing our ACE deviations in real time. And so the whole premise of the study is that before and after I add solar, I want to be able to maintain kind of the same level of reliability, the same number of flexibility violations.
Hey, Nick, so two things. One, your mic keeps going in and out, and I don't know if that's a function of you moving, but the other is so I see this. So just so I understand, I mean, what's a remedy for this? I mean, so if I see the symptom, what's the cure?
Yeah, so the remedy is to commit more resources and have more ramping capability on my system. So I may turn on an additional CT on my system for this hour, back down some of my other generation, so now they have additional flexibility.
It's dispatchable resources, so something that can react quickly, batteries, rotating machinery, something that you dial up and down quickly. That's the remedy.
Yeah, but I mean, even with the existing fleet, if you don't add new resources, you can still back down your conventional fleet and provide more ramping capability on your system, even with the existing. So you don't necessarily have to add a resource. You just have to operate your system differently, but you're operating it in a less efficient manner, which actually increases customer costs.
Okay. And then there's a question from Hamilton Davis. Didn't Astrape use a 10-minute interval for its 2021 Duke integration analysis? And if that's accurate, why is a 5-minute interval used for Santee?
No, I would have to go back and be sure, but I'm pretty sure Duke, we used a 5-minute dispatch as well. I think maybe the confusion there is that the operating reserves, the way that we're measuring ramping is on a 10-minute basis. So we're trying to understanding how much 10-minute ramping I can have, say at noon right here in my example, how much 10-minute ramping did I have? We still dispatch the system at 5-minute intervals.
Okay, great, thank you.
Trying to play with my speaker volume just a little bit. Is it still going out, Stuart?
Well, I think if you just stay close to your mic, it stays fairly stable.
Okay.
So don't move.
All right. All right, we can go to the next slide. So for this study, we looked at 4 different level tranches of solar, going from 500 on the system. Essentially, Santee Cooper has very little on the system today. So we jumped all the way from 500 and 500 increments all the way to 2,000. And again, the scenarios we evaluated, the base case was this 2029 example, which actually has the Winya coal units retired and a new, pretty flexible, very flexible 2-on-1 combined cycle in it. Then we looked at a 2026 study year, which really resembles the fleet we have today. No changes, no retirements, no new resources from what we have today. We wanted to understand what would it look like today if we had tried to integrate this amount of solar. And then along the 2029 cases, we added a case where we added 350 megawatts of storage, just try to understand how adding that storage resource would change integration costs. And one additional sensitivity, given that the seams market is coming, we created a sensitivity which added a little additional flexible unit from a market standpoint, and we'll show those results as well. Next slide. So the procedure, again, we start with a base case with no renewables in it. We get the base case to reasonable LOLE, reasonable reliability with additional market purchases. We put in operating reserves that we've seen historically to kind of baseline the case. And so in that no solar case in step one, we have some level of flexibility events. And that just kind of says, hey, that's kind of what we've seen in history. That's what we're comfortable with. Now we just want to maintain that same level when we add the solar. So step two, we add solar. When we add this net load uncertainty, we're going to see more flexibility violations if we don't increase our operating reserves. So then that leads us to step three, to mitigate those additional flexibility violations by adding additional operating reserves. And then step four, we actually calculate the cost between step three and step two, where we added those additional operating reserves. And we take the cost differential between step 2 and 3 and divide by the solar generation to get the solar integration costs. Next slide. I talked a lot about model uncertainty. And so looking at historical data, the load data is based on 1 year of 5-minute data here, and the solar is actually based on a year data, 1 year of data from a neighboring utility. Because Santee Cooper doesn't really have historical solar data, we got permission to use a neighbor's utilities data. And what you see in the blue is the load, and this represents kind of that 5-minute deviation from the forecast that you might see in the simulation. So load alone, there's a lot of uncertainty around load. The load is fairly volatile for this system. You're looking at plus or minus 200 megawatts-ish in load volatility. And then the orange represents how I can miss my forecast 5 minutes ahead for solar. You can see it's a fairly tight distribution at 500 solar. We see increases as we add more solar. But at the same time, we've embedded some weather diversity. As we have more locations and more solar, one unit may see cloud cover, one may not. And so we've embedded in some diversity benefit, along with the fact that load could move one way and solar could move the other intra-hour, which could also help deviate or mitigate some of this volatility. But again,
there was a question, I may take you back a little bit, but Ryan asked, how large is this flexible unit assumed to be? So the flexible unit you're talking about.
A flexible unit.
I think it's in terms of the ramping.
I mean, I guess I'm not quite following. We did add, I wonder if he's talking about the seams sensitivity where we added.
Yes, it is actually. We clarified for the seam sensitivity.
Okay, yeah. And I've got a slide here later for that, but it was a 200 megawatt resource that was made completely flexible. And I have a slide on that for later. All right, so next slide. So the previous slide showed all the points over an 8760 of what the volatility could look like. This just shows as we increase solar penetration on our x-axis, what I'm showing on the y-axis, and kind of bear with me, this gets pretty technical, but it's the 95th percentile of that 5-minute deviation. So if we flip back real quick, Stuart, you've got control. I'm looking at my 95th percentile. Can we jump back to the previous slide real quick? So if I'm looking at, let's say, the 2000 solar case, and I'm looking at my 95th percentile, it probably falls around 100 megawatts or so, maybe a little bit less. And so that's what I'm measuring. So my 100% percentile would be this max case up here, 220 megawatts. So now if we go forward again, so we're looking at this distribution, looking at the 95th percentile, and we can see if we go to the next slide, Stuart, as a percentage of the solar that we're adding, we actually see this decline, and that just kind of shows the diversity benefit and the volatility that we've got in our study. It's fairly substantial, and because of the data that we used for this was based on a neighboring region that actually has a little bit more diversity as far as footprint than Santee Cooper, this is probably a pretty aggressive assumption from a solar perspective of the diversity that we're going to see. But it is what's included in the study. Next slide. So now I jump right into the results. And so looking at the 2026 existing system, we've got kind of all 5 cases here. And this just shows the flexibility excursions or violations that occur with the same level of operating reserves in each case. And so we haven't changed any of the targets in CERVM. CERVM's going to commit load plus operating reserves in each of these cases. And because we add this solar, we're getting more volatility, more unknown, more 5-minute movements that we weren't expecting. And so we have more of these violations. And so now we need to go and correct those by, we'll add load following until all our Januaries kind of get back to the January number. And by month, we'll add load following to get them back to where it was before we added the solar. And if we jump to the next slide, we can see kind of what the results of that look like. So I've got 2 tables here. The top is what we're calling unoptimized version, and the bottom is the optimized version. The difference here being that in an unoptimized world, we have to determine, all right, when and where are we going to put these operating reserves? And so in the unoptimized version, we just put a flat additional online operating reserves in all solar hours. And of course, that certainly reduces my excursions, but it may not be the most optimal way to do it. The second way is we can actually go and see when the excursions are occurring and kind of put in a 12 by 24 targeted level of operating reserves. And so that's just the difference between the bottom and the top. So if I just look at the top case, to integrate 500 megawatts of solar, the system's already producing significant operating reserves, giving somewhat of a smaller system with large units. You've got some blockiness to your operating reserves already. So essentially there's 0 to 8 cents here, but essentially that's 0 cost for $500. As we jump though, you can see the cost increase. The first column here is the average cost, while the second column is the incremental cost. So it shows at each 500 megawatt increment what the cost is. And so given the existing system, you really start seeing kind of this exponential increase around 1,500 and 2,000 megawatts for the existing system. If we made no changes, no retirements, didn't add any additional flexible units, this is what we would see. The operating reserve column, it's the third column, is just a representation of the 10-minute reserves that were added. It's an average over 8760 hours, so it doesn't really show when and where, but it is just kind of shows you a number that if we were to take all the operating reserves that were added for the 2000 case, it would average 50 over the year. Of course, we're really forcing all of those to go on during solar hours. Then you can see the curtailment, so the overgen periods are the next 3 columns. So just from adding solar plus the integration, you can see that we get up to approximately 11% total curtailment of the 2,000 megawatts of solar in this unoptimized case. The difference between the solar curtailment, which includes all the curtailment, and the integration curtailment column, The integration curtailment is only due to the increase in operating reserves, whereas the incremental solar includes the addition of operating reserves. That also causes additional curtailment, plus just actually adding solar to the no solar case. So the top one, unoptimized. Now if we go and we target specific excursions, increase our load following during times when it's most needed, you can see the difference, and we actually lower integration costs. We lower the operating reserves that are actually required, as well as the curtailment. But again, I think the takeaway for the existing fleet is once you get to 1,500 megawatts and above, the system, it gets pretty costly to integrate solar. Next slide. So now if we look at the 2029 case, which has a 2-on-1 combined cycle in it, you can see our excursions, they've actually come down in magnitude, even in the no solar case compared to my 2026 case. I've got this fast ramping combined cycle, but I'm still going to go through the same process. I'm going to have the operating reserves in my no solar case based on historical information. I'm going to run the case, even though I've got this fast combined cycle, my excursions are going to come down. But when I add solar, I'm still going to see an increase because my net load volatility is increased. We can go to the next slide. So looking at the same costs under this scenario, well, we've got this faster, flexible combined cycle. You can see the integration costs are much more manageable in both the unoptimized and optimized case. I mean, even up to 2,000 megawatts, we're seeing on average for that 2,000 megawatts, it's $1.70 a megawatt hour in the optimized case. That results in the last 500 megawatts costing $4. And you can see the operating reserves that were increased, as well as the curtailment. The curtailment's still there. We're still having to overcommit to manage the solar, so we're still having large amounts of curtailment at 2,000 megawatts. But the cost to do that, because we've made our system more flexible, is lower. All right, next slide. The next sensitivity was, we've still got our 2-on-1 combined cycle, but we're going to replace some CT capacity with a 350 megawatt battery sensitivity. And so this provided somewhat non-intuitive results, right? Because the costs are slightly higher than they were in the 2-on-1 CC case, which was unexpected. And so what happens here is, because we've put the battery in the no solar case as well as the solar case, so it's in both cases, we didn't just go add battery, it's in the no solar case and the comparative with solar case. Our flexibility violations actually even got lower in our no solar case because of this battery. The battery is more flexible than the combined cycle, than the CT that it replaced, sorry. But because now we have a lower flexibility target, because we're still going to maintain that our flexibility needs to be the same before and after I add solar, I actually saw a slight cost increase, which was non-intuitive. The big takeaway here, though, is that the curtailment came down substantially. Now that we're charging that battery across the day, when all that solar is being injected into the system, we saw a significant reduction in curtailment. If you remember, the percentage at 2,000 in the previous slide was around 9%. So we're almost cutting that curtailment in half in this case. But the integration costs actually slightly increase. Let's jump to the next slide. So because of that non-intuitive result, we wanted to run one more case with the battery that said, instead of letting the flexibility target fall, let's keep it at what it was for the combined cycle case. So essentially, in our no solar case, we moved operating reserves until we hit the target in our no solar case for the combined cycle, making those equivalent. And now we go from there and we add solar. We actually see these results, which are really much in line with the combined cycle results, which kind of tells us we still need operating reserves, and we're still having to meet those additional load following requirements, and there's still a cost to that. Essentially what we also see in the analysis is that the additional operating reserves are occurring and being needed during low net load periods. So during these low net load periods, the battery's actually probably already dispatching. And so that's another reason we're not seeing this significant benefit during those hours. The battery's already being needed for capacity at that point. It's being discharged. And so it's not sitting there only serving ancillaries. But you do still see the significant curtailment benefit. But again, I think this case too, we didn't optimize it. It's a sensitivity, so it should be compared against the unoptimized combined cycle case. But given 2029 and the retirement of Winya and adding some of these flexible resources, we still see kind of this is $0 to $2 range for integrating solar. And I think I've got one more sensitivity, Stuart.
Yeah, and then we got a couple of questions. So why don't you go ahead and touch on that seam sensitivity, and then I'd like to just pose the questions, and then we'll take a break.
Yeah. So the seam sensitivity again started with 2029 case with the 2-on-1 combined cycle. And all we did was take some of the inflexible market megawatts that we put in to make the system reliable and actually made them very flexible. So we took 200 megawatts. They've got a 20-minute start time, but they're completely flexible. I think they're in 50 megawatt blocks, so they can go from 0 to 50 megawatts. There's a 20-minute start time to kind of reflect what we're currently expecting with seams. But again, similar to the battery, because our no solar case assumes seams is there, as well as the solar case, our flexibility excursions in the no solar case came down somewhat. And so the cost actually remained very similar to the base case. We're still seeing kind of this $0 to $2 range. We still see the significant curtailment. The most curtailment benefit we saw was due to the storage. And so I think that the takeaways here, given the current system, current fleet, certainly getting to 1,500 megawatts and 2,000 megawatts of solar, while we think it's possible to be done, there is substantial cost to that. And so it likely would make sense, hopefully, as we move through time and get to those levels, that Santee Cooper does have some more flexible options on the table, and potentially retired some of more of the slower, less flexible resources. And Stuart, yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay, good. We got, so you've generated some really good questions. I'm just going to sort of take them in the order they popped up. So Jake asked, so all the 2029 cases include a 2x1 CC. Were there no scenarios where Winya capacity is replaced with only solar plus storage?
Yeah, that's correct, Jay.
So there weren't any. Okay. Are there any power quality issues? This is from Dennis. Are there any power quality issues from 500 megawatts to 2,000 megawatts of inverters pumping harmonics onto the grid?
Yeah, I mean, as part of this study, that wasn't something that was looked at or studied. The model is a pipe and bubble representation of the system, and so we're not getting down to that level of detail.
Okay. And then Ryan asked a couple of questions. I think I'll take his in series and then come back to Jonathan. So given that Seams is coming and an existing market purchases already exist, is the base case being run as an island? And I think you started by saying you were treating it like an island. Is that correct?
So the model, Santee Cooper is islanded, but we've added I guess, purchase proxies, if you will, Ryan. So to get the system to be reliable, we realized that Santee Cooper, kind of based on the prior reserve margin study, if Santee Cooper is going to maintain a 17% reserve margin, but there's no market assistance, then it's going to be fairly unreliable. So in order to make the system reliable, we do add in CT proxy units that the system has access to serve load throughout the study. So it's islanded with market proxy units, if you will, that on the existing fleet.
Right, and I think that's consistent with what we discussed before. So So actually, we'll take Jonathan and go back to Ryan's, and then I think we'll head to break. So Jonathan says, apologies if this has been previously addressed, but what is the assumed resource providing the operating reserves slash load following?
Yeah, so that can be any resource in any given hour, Jonathan. The model's going to determine that economically. So any resource that's minimum capacity is below its max capacity or has that opportunity to be online, then it can serve load following. And so serve on the model is going to determine what's the most economic commitment and dispatch of those resources to serve both load and the additional load following.
Okay. And then the last one, I think we'll take, Ryan's got a nest of questions, and there are a couple others, but I think that we can work on those during the break. So what was the reason for a 350 megawatt battery to be installed? It seems there's additional opportunity to enhance or both enhance flexibility in the system while reducing further curtailments. Let me clarify. While there is only a 350 megawatt battery, what's the duration of the battery? And then from that, it's with 4% curtailment occurring throughout almost all of the scenarios. It seems that more storage is needed, which has added flexibility benefits too.
Yeah,
So
and that's a better
so,
question for Santee Cooper, but I can at least address what was modeled. So the 350 megawatt battery was 4 hour storage, replacing a CT in the model. I think it was just fairly generic. We just kind of wanted to understand how things might move if you add it.
okay, and then folks, I know there's several open questions, but I know I need a bio break, and I suspect others in the audience may as well. So what I'm going to propose is we go ahead and take our break, come back at 3 as scheduled. So it would be just a quick break, and in the meantime, the folks in the back will work on these questions, and I think Nick can support them in answering those questions. And when we come back at 3, we'll let Bob take us into the discussion of where this has taken us to in terms of future resources. So with that, why don't we go ahead and take the break? Let's I hope everybody's okay with it. We've been having good conversation. I'd like to just come back at 3, if you will, please. So why don't we put up the break slide? Thank you all for being willing to shorten the break. I don't want to cut off any of the conversation. There's a lot of good questions, and I want to make sure we're leaving ample time for you all to see the analysis and ask your questions and get them answered. So, okay, Bob.
Good afternoon. Thanks for attending the afternoon stakeholder meeting session number 4. For the next hour or so, I'll be reviewing with you recent updates to major assumptions and highlight some initial portfolio modeling results. Before we get started, we made the same statement last time. I just want to remind everyone that we are still reviewing, developing assumptions, modifying our models, et cetera. Especially assumptions that may be affected by changing economic and market conditions, which I think everybody can agree we've been in a fairly significant state of upheaval over the last 6 months or so. If there are any significant changes to major assumptions following this meeting, we'll be updating those and posting those to the IRP stakeholder forum. So please keep abreast of the forum if possible. Go ahead. So some of the key financing assumptions, again, these are from Santee Cooper's perspective, predominantly. We've updated assumptions for debt and for discount rates based upon Santee Cooper's financial advisor. The long-term interest rate and discount rates have been increased to 2.25% from 5.5% that were assumed in June. And short-term commercial paper has increased from 4.25% up from 2.75% from this past June. It's probably also just for purposes of thinking through this and comparing, to longer term conditions. The numbers we had in June were higher even still than Santee Cooper had previously been modeling. As recently as 12 months ago, Santee Cooper was using debt and discount rates of approximately 3 3/4. So we've seen a fairly significant movement in just the last 12 months on debt and interest rates, due largely to geopolitical and financial conditions here domestically. As many are probably aware, lending rates have really increased by 200 to 300 basis points over the last couple of years. So we needed to make sure that we were reflecting that in our modeling efforts. We continue to model a 2.3 inflation rate, and keep in mind these are long-term rates across the board here that we're simulating. Well, I think most people recognize a fairly significant increase in inflation rates just over this last year. If you look long-term and look at the information reported by the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, we do see a lot of fluctuations up and down with what the long-term projections of inflation rates are, and we still think a 2.3% long-term after this year is still an appropriate assumption. Go ahead. Fuel price forecast. Just to remind everybody, we've updated our fuel price forecast from where we were previously. A lot of this is due to changes in market conditions that everybody has been witnessing, as you go to pump and put gas in your own car, electricity prices at your home if you have an electric vehicle. And we've really seen some fairly volatile market conditions. As a reminder, for purposes of the IRP, we're using long-term fundamental fuel price forecasts. That's generally consistent with the precedent that's been established from prior Duke and Dominion IRP filings. That fundamental price forecast that we're using for the IRP is based on an average of the this year's, 2022's annual energy outlook published by the Energy Information Administration, and recent fundamental forecasts published by S&P Global. We also use a nuclear fuel price forecast for the VC Summer resource that's prepared by Dominion. Next slide. So gas price forecast. The chart on the right depicts natural gas prices for the low, medium, and high price sensitivities for Henry Hub that we'll be using for the IRP. The medium forecast was derived from an average of the AEO reference case and a recent S&P forecast for Henry Hub. The low and high sensitivity cases are based on relative differences between the AEO reference case and the AEO high oil and gas supply case and the low oil and gas supply cases. Relative monthly prices are based on recent price patterns observed for forward prices for Henry Hub. Compared to the natural gas price forecast that was presented in the last stakeholder meeting, the median price forecast in the chart depicts prices approximately 40% higher for 2023. This increase is reduced to approximately 20% by 2030 and achieves a relatively stable 6 to 7% higher price by the mid-2030s. In addition to the gas prices you see here for Henry Hub, we also add natural gas commodity prices, natural gas pipeline variable distribution charges or variable transportation charges that are derived from existing tariffs for local Southeast regional gas pipelines. We'll also be modeling fixed costs for firm natural gas supply for combined cycle resources. Coal price forecast. The coal price forecast you see on the right depicts the prices we intend to use for the IRP. These are delivered prices. Prices have been derived from an average, again, from an average of the AEO and the S&P forecast for Appalachian and Illinois coal basins, and that are currently used to supply Santee Cooper coal. While this is an average delivered price, we utilize different weightings for different resources from Illinois Basin, Northern Appalachian, and Central Appalachian coal sources. Forecast rail delivery costs are added to develop this delivered coal price forecast. Similar to the method used to develop the natural gas price sensitivities, the low and high price cases for coal are based upon the relative difference between the low and high oil and gas supply cases published in the annual energy outlook. Compared to the coal price forecast presented in the last stakeholder meeting, The median price forecast in the chart depicts a price that is approximately 30%, 38% higher in 2023. So not dissimilar from the cost increase we saw for natural gas. And this increase reduces to approximately 6% higher by 2030 and reduces to approximately the same price as we saw in the prior June update by about the 2040 timeframe, 2041 timeframe. Next slide. So resource options. Santee Cooper has updated assumptions for combined cycle, combustion turbine, and reciprocating internal combustion engine resource options, and has added a small nuclear reactor resource option for consideration within its IRP. Assumptions have been updated considering a number of sources, including the EPRI tag web resource, which we've mentioned at our prior stakeholder meetings, information from equipment vendors, and engineering estimates developed by both Santee Cooper and others. Next slide. Since the June stakeholder meeting, one of the most significant things, if you compared this matrix against the matrix that we presented back in June, really is the increase in capital costs that have increased for the CT and combined cycle. The combined cycle estimates for the 2-on-1 combined cycles are relatively higher. 1-on-1 combined cycles are significantly higher than what we modeled previously. O&M costs are based upon the EPRI tag web 2022 update. So we haven't modified those assumptions since the last time that we prepared this set of assumptions. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about renewable resource options. This is probably where there's the greatest amount of interest. You can go ahead to the next slide. And, you know, one of the most significant impacts that we've seen since the last time we met was the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act. We talked previously today about impacts that it might have, the IRA may have on energy efficiency, electric vehicle adoption, distributed generation adoption, et cetera. So this portion of the presentation is going to really focus on how the IRA will be impacting utility scale renewables. As I'm sure most people are aware with this, with the IRA, signed into law in August. The law is addresses multiple topics. Provisions of the IRA are really the most significant impacts. Other provisions of the IRA address financing costs for utility scale renewable resources that Santee Cooper may consider. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little out of my script here, but getting back to it. You know, one of the most significant aspects of the IRA is the expansion of tax credits that we have for renewable resources. Tax credits that were previously phased out this decade, in other words, the ITC, PTC, they're phased out this decade or last, have been extended. These tax credits are extended through at least 2034, possibly longer, depending upon whether the US reaches certain greenhouse gas reduction targets. Additionally, the tax credits have been made available for standalone battery energy storage. If you may recall previously, battery energy storage had to be associated with another renewable resource and show charging of at least 75%, and the amount of investment tax credit that was available for battery was scaled based upon the amount of energy that was provided from those renewable resources. Now battery receives its own standalone credit without restrictions for renewable charging requirements. Other aspects of the IRA include options to monetize credits, which, you know, the monetization of credits may allow Santee Cooper to receive the value of credits directly from the Treasury Department or sell credits to others, collect and sell credits for renewable implementation. At this point in time, we are not modeling Santee Cooper as being the developer and implementer of large-scale solar and battery technologies. Instead, what we're modeling is Santee Cooper purchasing output from projects that are developed by others. And therefore, we're modeling PPA pricing, which you'll see on the following charts, that are consistent with the current interpretations of the IRA and how that may affect the pricing the developers will achieve, taking into account, you know, a 30% investment tax credit consistent with the IRA. We intend to model the ITC as persisting through the end of the IRP study period. Essentially, this is what we're intending here, is that at this point in time, we have not seen any forecast or projections that would indicate that the greenhouse gas, this 75% reduction or targets required to cancel or phase out the ITC and other tax credits within the IRA. We haven't seen any studies yet that would indicate that those targets will be achieved by 2032 or even any time there soon after. So therefore, we intend to continue to assume that the ITCs will be available through the end of the study period. I'll remind people too that if you go back and look at the June stakeholder process, that the 30% tax credit that we're modeling through the end of this study period, or the current sets of assumptions for the IRP, that previously we were modeling a 10% threshold extending for the ITC extending through the end of the IRP study period. So it's not that we're capturing 30% beyond the middle part of this decade. It's that we're capturing an incremental 20% beyond the middle part of this decade. Next slide. So renewable PPA pricing. For purposes of the IRP, Santee Cooper intends to model renewable resources, solar, battery, offshore wind, and onshore wind as power purchase agreements. While tax credits under the IRA may be anticipated to reduce PPA pricing, as we just discussed, multiple market trends have recently resulted in an increase in PPA pricing. These include import restrictions, especially those with respect to solar equipment imported from Asian countries, equipment cost escalation in general. This is not just for renewable, but it's industry-wide. There's also a market increase in general inflation over the last year of close to 7%, which is much higher than we were anticipating as a general inflation rate assumption. And as previously mentioned, higher costs for financing. As I previously said, we've seen at least a 200 to 300 basis point increase in the cost of debt and equity considerations since NREL developed some of the initial assumptions for the ATB. It's also important to note that adjustments for market conditions are necessary to assure that all resources are treated consistently throughout the IRP analysis. In other words, we aren't tacking on cost of the renewable resources, but we're already considering higher cost for the standard or more traditional fossil resources and other technologies throughout our evaluation. When modeling PPA prices, Santee Cooper has made the following changes and assumptions or modeling approaches since the June stakeholder meeting. We've adopted assumptions for the June 2022 release of the ATB from NREL. We're assuming a higher inflation rate from 2021 to 2022, currently estimated to be at least a 7% cost of a rate of inflation from between those years. Higher capital costs for solar and battery resources, approximately a 15% higher cost. These are based upon recent information reported by NREL in September this year for modeled market prices reported in NREL's 2022 Q1 solar and storage cost benchmark, which, as I said, was just released this past September. We're also looking at higher debt and equity rates. And of course, we would be reducing or reflecting the impacts of the IRA for tax credits. Since June, we've also had multiple conversations with NREL staff regarding the appropriate interpretation and use of assumptions that are contained in the ATB. These discussions led us to use and develop an independent levelized cost of energy model. And within that model, we are still utilizing the ATB moderate case projections for capital and O&M costs directly as they're reported, and resource capacity factors directly as they're reported within the ATB. New solar, next one. So for the new solar resources, what you're seeing here in the chart on the right-hand side, the red line depicts the levelized cost of energy for solar resources that was computed for the prior stakeholder meeting. The green dashed line depicts the levelized cost of energy using current market cost assumptions and phase out of the ITC after 2032. And the solid green line depicts the levelized cost of energy for solar resources under the same market cost considerations, but extension of the ITC through the end of the IRP study period. We intend to use the pricing depicted in the solid green line within the IRP evaluations. Other modeling assumptions that we also incorporate within our evaluation is production profiles for diversified and distributed solar resources throughout the Santee Cooper system based upon the NREL system advisor model and ELC and cost of integration assumptions derived from the results of the Astrape studies. We recognize that you may be interested in how the various influences and adjustments we have on market prices may affect the difference between the red and green line. So by way of example for the solar pricing, recent increases in market and inflation have resulted in about an 8 to 17% increase in the difference between the red and green line, depending upon which year you're in. Higher cost of financing result in about a 30% increase in the difference between the lines. Changes in the levelized cost of energy model result in about a 15 to 20% increase between the lines. And the IRA results in an incremental increase of, or decrease, excuse me, of about 20% that otherwise we would see for the prior assumptions that I just discussed. Go ahead, next slide. For battery energy and storage, same basic type of principles and characteristics. Again, the red line reflects a levelized cost of capacity in this case that we had in prior stakeholder meetings. The green dashed line shows what it would look like after the phase out of the ITC under the new IRA. And the solid green line depicts what we intend to model for batteries under the IRP, which assumes an extension of the IRA through the study period. The June and current projections are closer for battery than they were for solar, due in part to a couple different issues. If you recall what I mentioned earlier, the ITC that we were assuming for batteries previously had already been discounted by 25% to depict the system charging that may occur for batteries and therefore the impact it had on the ITC. We were also previously, as early as our June model, had already recognized that there was likely to be an increase in the cost of batteries, and we were already reflecting that within our prior analysis and our prior assumptions that we were showing you at the June stakeholder meeting. Similar to storage, other modeling assumptions for battery include ELCC based upon the Astrape studies. We also, because this question has been asked, we also intend to show multiple battery duration configurations. We're going to depend upon the ATB assumptions for this. ATB contains a number of different configurations for duration on battery, and we intend to model that. What you're seeing on the chart here is a 4-hour battery, but that certainly doesn't mean that that'll be the limit on the assumptions we'll assume for our evaluation. New onshore wind resources, please. For new onshore wind resources, we're modeling PPA prices in much the same structure and method for computing as we previously discussed for solar and battery. Onshore wind is being assumed or being modeled and assumed to be a class 9 resource or class 9 wind patterns within based upon the simulation in both EPRI ATB assumptions as well as for profiles that we're simulating for purposes of within the NREL SAM model. Other modeling assumptions for onshore wind include the ELCC and cost of integration derived from prior and other IRP filings and other industry sources. One of the things I will mention here is that wind is a component that we're still investigating both onshore and offshore, which you're going to see in a moment. We recognize that there's really no good empirical data for solar or for wind farms here in South Carolina. So I have to say that we're still investigating, still looking at it. The NREL numbers that we have represented on this chart truly depict the kind of a nationalized average, large wind farms that are more consistent with implementation thus far and historically throughout the country. There's, as I said, there's just no good empirical data here for South Carolina. So you may see ultimately the pricing for wind increasing further from what we see here on this chart. Next slide.
Bob, before we head off to the
Sure.
discussion point, there's a couple open questions. So
Sure.
let's think, there's one from Jake Duncan that I think is right on the slide. Can you list the differences between the prior assumption and IRA update that Bob shared verbally? And then there's a couple other questions. I'll let you think about that. And then there's a couple of questions, another one from Jake and a series of questions from Ryan around how your capital costs were developed. But why don't we go ahead with I'll just read it again for you. Can you list the difference between the prior assumption and the IRA update that Bob shared verbally?
So happy to incorporate a table of the kind of the raw percentages that I discussed earlier. Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, another question?
Yeah, so there's a series of questions. Ryan's got some about the CTs and Jake has similar questions about the nuclear. I'll just start with Ryan's. So the
Okay.
2x1 CC capital costs seem very low relative to neighboring regions, DESC CC costs. What do you think the basis for this is? And for context, he's offering that DESC has $1163 per kW for a 2x1 CC, and you're showing $792, which is very low from public sources I've reviewed. In addition to this, the CT cost quoted by DESC were upwards of $1,100 a kW as well. They had approximately a 90% increase in CT costs, and he sees that these are substantial differences.
Do you mind going back to this one? So I can tell you that the 2-on-1, one caveat that I would caution, the roughly $800 a kW that we're showing there, do need to make sure that these are apples to apples. So whether they're an HAO3 class technology or not, you can certainly see a fairly significant cost reduction based purely upon changing from an HAO2 to an HAO3 configuration just due to the increased size of the equipment. If that at the end of the day is identified as a non-issue, I would suggest there are other factors that we need to double check and make sure are correctly reflected within any comparison that might be made. The capital costs that we have here exclude any costs for land, which we anticipate to be minimal, transmission interconnection and natural gas interconnection. So the direct facilities to intertie this facility with the transmission system and to interconnect it with the natural gas pipeline. So we need to be careful and make sure that the appropriate cost considerations for those components are included. Assuming another critical component here is also based upon the rating of the unit. We're using an average ambient rating. We need to make sure that the cost assumptions that may be represented by Dominion are not based upon a summer rating, which would tend to increase their assumption. If we got to the point that all of those assumptions were clarified and adjusted for, then I'd say we're into a situation of you know whose assumptions are better, whose assumptions are more representative. I can tell you that the assumptions that we've been working with here are based upon not only the EPRI tag data, but other engineering estimates that have been prepared internally by Santee Cooper and their engineers, developed for some detailed representations of capital costs associated with a recent construction. So this is the reason I say that is this is not old data. This is relatively new data. It represents current costs for construction and equipment. So beyond that, recognizing the adjustments I said, it would be down to a situation of validating or verifying that the underlying sources of information between the two parties are either consistent or not, and where those differences might lie.
Okay. And then he has a follow-up, and then I'll go to Jake's, but
Okay.
Relative, is the expectation that the natural gas connection and transmission costs of a 2x1 CC are minimal. I think you said yes.
Generally minimal. I won't say they're, I mean, what's minimal from this standpoint is enough to make many of us very happy with retirement. So it's a function of how big out of the grand total. I would say that those costs are generally relatively minor. They're enough to move the needle, but they aren't zero.
Okay, and then following up with a comment on the renewable cost increases, are there not cost increases coming for thermal resources such as, so I guess, he quoted the DESC stuff above, and you've explained the differences. I guess the way to frame the question then is, do these costs that you're showing here take into consideration the recent cost increases for thermal resources?
I would say yes. To the best of our ability, we believe that these numbers represent costs that are consistent with current estimates for technology today. So I'm not sure I can state that any more succinctly.
Okay. And then this final question in that string is it possible for stakeholders to get access to some of these assumptions? I guess that's
I'll tell you what I would recommend in that regard, because these, I would suggest these are our assumptions. If there is a more detailed question, that request be made to the IRP forum, and we can follow up accordingly.
Okay, great. And so then Jake's question, similar in nature, but is focused on more on the nuclear side of thing.
Sure.
The question is, where did the SMR, it throws me SMR on my initials. So I always, I try not to take it personal. Where did the SMR estimate come from? In an IRP stakeholder meeting with Dominion, South Carolina yesterday, they shared an initial estimate of $64.90 per kW, then verbally stated that their estimate had increased to $12,354 per kW. Of course, costs can differ for utilities, but this is an order of magnitude difference and should be investigated. So
I would agree. If Dominion's willing to share that information with us and how they got there, we'd be interested in it too. I think the uncertainty with regard to the SMR technology, we haven't even hit plant 000 or 001 yet, so it is uncertain. We're relying upon, for purposes of the information presented here, information from the EPRI TagWeb data source. They have been in contact with UAMPS to review their assumptions. This is not the lowest cost estimate that would be developed or assumed by under the EPRI tag or UAMPS. This is what EPRI would classify as their conservative assumption for the SMR technology. So if we're seeing a doubling of that cost, then I would certainly be interested in what might be driving those assumptions. Any additional information that might be provided by the questioner would certainly be desirable.
Great. Yeah. So if you have anything beyond the conversation with Dominion, that'd be great. Okay. Let's see. Why don't I let you go ahead and I'll look through and make sure everything else is being responded.
So on the offshore wind, as I think as everybody's aware, there's really limited opportunities for offshore wind. We have no existing empirical information regarding these assets. We're making as good of an estimate as we can. Again, we're using the NREL data to come up with our underlying assumptions. We have been in contact, as many people will be aware. 2 leases were recently awarded off the coast or south of the coast of North Carolina that could be transmitted into the Santee Cooper system. The Duke was one of those. Total, French company is another one. We have had very high level conversations, just introductions with Total. And while I would say, if anything, our price assumptions here based upon those conversations might be a little on the conservative side. I would suggest and caution there are no conversations that are ongoing with regard to indicative pricing or any other. This was purely a very high level discussion about, what might the market be in the future. So I want to caution people to not hit us up for data requests, because there is no data to acquire other than exactly what I just told you. So, okay, let's move forward. So thinking about resource portfolios. Our portfolio is, as many of you are aware, hang on a second, I'm adjusting my screen. This is not inconsistent with what we prepared and showed in the June meeting. Few things that have transpired since that point in time is we've nailed down and adopted a reserve margin, which we're going to hit 17% targets by 2026. We've got assumptions in there consistent with previously as a retirement of Winya, as well as the Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head combustion turbines by 2029. And load growth consistent with the underlying load forecast previously presented and discussed by Greg. What this results in is approximately over 1,600 megawatts of firm capacity need by the 2029 timeframe. Significant chunk of capacity. We intend to model, you'll see there's a little bit of deficiency or deficit going on in the early years. We intend to model this with short-term PPA pricing estimates that we have from the Energy Authority, as well as opportunities for the model to select renewable resources, solar, battery, wind if appropriate. So we'll be satisfying the short-term amounts with those resources. I will remind people that may or may not be aware, Santee Cooper is currently filed for approval before the Public Service Commission for their competitive procurement of renewable energy. That process, if approved by the PSC, and if we are able to execute an RFP in a timely fashion, would likely allow us to get renewable resources online by around the 2026 timeframe. Longer term research.
Bob, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
So Jonathan Lee had a follow-up question. I think we should answer it so that people understand the context of the slide. And so as a follow-up, are all of the costs shown resource capital costs and the renewable PPA costs, the finalized assumptions that will be used in the IRP study, barring any major events?
I would suggest, as I mentioned, that the wind technologies are still under review and investigation and are subject to change. I would say that we feel fairly comfortable with the fossil fuel and nuclear resource assumptions, as well as the solar and battery assumptions.
Okay, great.
If there are any changes, I'm not going to commit that these are absolute and will not change, because you always have to run the chance of uncovering something new that should be factored into the evaluation. Any changes?
I think you recognize that in the way he framed his question.
Yeah, any changes will be posted to the forum, and we'll make sure that it's.
We've had a few of those in the last several months. So
yeah. Longer term resource additions we're going to look at in satisfying that large need once the wind plant retires, utilizing multiple portfolio scenario evaluations. So let's see the next slide. We presented this earlier at the last stakeholder meeting. We intend to evaluate multiple resource portfolios. As anyone within this industry would expect, one of the initial and expected portfolios would assume a fully optimized economic portfolio decision. This could include traditional resources, it could include renewable resources, all things on the table with respect to how to meet that overarching need for new capacity, as well as the resources that can meet it. I will say that, as Eddie pointed out earlier today, although I would say it quite differently than he said, you know, the studies to date that Santee Cooper has performed, starting with the plans that started back in 2019, have all indicated, the reform plan, excuse me, have all indicated that a new combined cycle is likely to be the most cost-effective resource decision for Santee Cooper, beginning with the retirement of the Wynya generation station. I will say, though, that it's important to understand that Santee Cooper has not committed to this resource, and the sole purpose, or one of the primary purposes of the IRP, is to continue and put forth the evaluation of not only an economically justified plan or optimum plan, but looking at alternative scenarios, such as a future coal retirement scenario, where we look at retiring the cross resources to remove total CO2 emissions in the mid or early 30s, an environmentally constrained portfolio where we do not allow any future fossil resources to be added. We look only at renewable resource additions to satisfy all future needs. And then, of course, a net zero CO2 plan, which would target certain CO2 mass emission reductions by 2050, which is required under statute for Santee Cooper. But we intend to hit a 70% target by 2030 from 2005 levels, and allow for minimal CO2 offsets in the later years. By examining and evaluating and comparing and contrasting each of these portfolios, which we may also look at some additional side case portfolios to help the commission and the interveners understand the decisions, as well as the sensitivity of resource plans to various assumptions. Evaluating these portfolios, comparing and contrasting, looking at these multiple portfolios across multiple assumptions for load, DSM levels, fuel prices, and CO2 pricing, looking at the risk of those, and looking at changes in cost, system reliability, other appropriate metrics, and ultimately coming up with a recommended portfolio based upon these results that truly looks at the multiple portfolios under consideration. It's certainly not Santee Cooper's intent to put forth an IRP that rubber stamps a decision that's already been made. Next slide. So we have begun model testing, and we wanted to provide the stakeholders with an understanding of where some of our results are headed today. Under the economically optimized portfolio, we're seeing a new combined cycle, a new frame CT, and solar installed to meet capacity energy needs immediately with the retirement of the Wynya station, and continuing to see additional solar, onshore wind, and battery installed throughout the planning horizon. So as you might expect, given the underlying assumptions that we have for traditional resources, renewable resources, fuel pricing, you're liable to see a case where replacing the Wynya baseload requirements with a combined cycle asset is a kind of a logical conclusion that may result from an economically optimized portfolio. Under a future coal retirement portfolio, we're seeing a very similar result. Keep in mind that when we look at the economic coal retirement portfolio, not only are we looking at the 1,600 megawatts that are needed in order to satisfy Wynya reserve margin and load growth, but we're looking at another 2,400 megawatts that would need to be added to the system as firm capacity in order to meet the retirement of the cross resource. So we're looking at close to 4,000 megawatts of capacity that would need to be added in order to satisfy all capacity requirements, which is a large amount of capacity that would need to be added. Under that scenario, we're seeing a mixture of really all of the above. Combined cycles, turbines, solar, offshore, onshore wind, battery energy storage, in order to meet those full retirements over the planning horizon. And then under an environmentally constrained portfolio, what we're looking at here is, can we meet our total obligation, assuming no future fossil additions, and The model thus far has shown that we are meeting those targets and can meet those targets, the capacity targets and energy requirements with solar, wind, and battery energy storage. Next slide. Well, let me, before you move on, I will clarify, looking at the big yellow box at the top, I want to make sure that people understand that these are directional results. You should not bake these into any kind of conclusions that Santee Cooper will ultimately not change or not move from these plans, these directional results that we're currently seeing right now. These are relatively simplified portfolio optimization analyses. We recognize that we need additional refined portfolio modeling and analyses that are very likely to produce different results than what you see here depicted. As I said earlier, it's important to recognize that these in portfolio strategies that we'll be evaluating, they'll be further evaluated for sensitivity and various risk considerations, and that all that information will help inform Santee Cooper's recommended or preferred portfolio in its IRP filing. Next slide.
Yeah, so Bob, before you go there, so there are
Sure.
a couple of questions I think are pretty timely right now that you're probably the best person to answer. So Ben asked, Ben Garris asked, how will the earliest practical retirement of Cross be determined for the future of coal retirements portfolio? Will there be a separate coal retirement analysis performed?
At this point in time, we are not anticipating a separate coal retirement analysis. We recognize that that may ultimately come through the IRP hearing process, but given time constraints, our process that we currently have in place, we feel like we will be handling the largest aspects of the coal retirement, what would normally come through a coal retirement plan. So within our existing IRP process, so let me explain that a bit. We're obviously looking at a previously announced retirement of Wynya project, or the Wynya generating station, in 2029. We're looking at a earliest practical retirement of the coal Cross retirement station in 2034. We have discussed both internally and externally the potential to model an earlier coal retirement strategy in order to make sure that we capture any ELG costs that might be available should we retire Cross earlier. I will remind people that Cross has already had installed the majority of the equipment and systems that are necessary in order for Cross to meet ELG requirements. So there is very little cost to be saved by retiring Cross early, but we recognize there may be some interest in understanding the sensitivity, the evaluation to that. And then we've also talked about, well, what could happen if we need to extend the operating conditions for Wynya and incur additional ELG costs. So all of those ideas are still on the table. Through that set of evaluations, we hope to provide sufficient information to allow stakeholders as well as Santee Cooper in general to get a better grasp and understanding of how various decisions for coal retirements would affect economic strategies and cost for systems for Santee Cooper.
Great, thanks. So Ryan's got a question. I think it's pretty straightforward, but I think, again, you're probably the best person. Are there any annual limits on solar capacity additions? If so, what's the basis for those?
Assumption to be developed, to be determined. We recognize that Duke has significantly limited their solar implementations. I won't say significantly, has limited their solar implementations based upon the practical ability to add solar to their system over time. At this point in time, we're treating our evaluation to assume that solar can be installed without limitations. So at this point, we have not factored that into our evaluation. Should we see cases that are approaching limits of solar implementation that start to create concerns for the transmission service and integration considerations, then we will factor that into our evaluations. But at this time, we aren't seeing a need to do that, Stuart.
Okay, great. And then Finley Salter has got a question. Do any of the current portfolios to be studied change previously discussed assumptions related to Wynyard generating station closure?
No.
I thought that was the answer, but I wanted to be
Yep.
sure.
No, that's fine.
And then just one more. Leah Wellborn asked, can Santee Cooper review what sensitivity cases are being evaluated in terms of sensitivity scenarios and assumptions that these portfolios will be studied under?
Yeah, I would say that the fuel price forecast sensitivities, you can see that in the prior slides that are presented here today. Through the DSM NPS studies, we'll be reporting the low, medium, and high assumptions that we'll assume for DSM. With regard to load forecasts, the low, medium, and high forecasts have already been presented in the June stakeholder meeting, as well as CO2 assumptions.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Bob.
Sure. So what's next for portfolio evaluations? As Patricia mentioned earlier and Jim mentioned earlier, we're in the process of updating energy efficiency and DR projections based upon market potential studies. There's ongoing review, of course, and possible adjustments to major assumptions. As I just mentioned, our most focus at this point in time is likely the wind assets, given further consideration of cost in South Carolina. Then our next step is to refine and look harder at our optimum portfolio evaluations. We need to add in offshore wind and SMR resources, which we haven't to this point in time, and consider those as resource options. We need to improve or assess system reliability as part of the evaluation and make sure that we are appropriately factoring that in to our evaluations. And to the extent appropriate, we need to make sure that we're considering additional operating reserves and fast response resources as components within the evaluation and ultimately the portfolios evaluated and recommended. Again, we haven't started, and the reason we didn't look at initial results, we haven't begun our net zero CO2 portfolio evaluation, so that needs to be done. And then as we were just discussing, we've got a full evaluation of portfolio sensitivity assumptions and underlying risk analysis that are requested and required by the statutes and precedent for IRP filings in the state of South Carolina. Next slide. All this leads us to our IRP filing on May 15th with the commission. We recognize and fully acknowledge some of the comments that were made earlier. We intend to, as our process proceeds and assumptions or evaluations change, we certainly intend to post that information to the forum so that stakeholders are aware, and we'll notify registered stakeholders with the date for future meetings as they get closer.
Yeah, and so just along those lines, Bob, one thing for the stakeholders to note, so the slides that we reviewed today in this meeting are posted to the site. Santee Cooper has been trying to get the slide decks posted in advance, even if it means that there are some updates between the time they post the original and the day of the meeting. And so a couple of you noticed that a few of these slides had some edits to them. So please bear in mind that there's always the latest version of the slides are posted. All right. And hopefully you're getting, if you've signed up for the IRP, you're getting notifications when those documents are posted. So before we move to closing, I think Rahul, I think Be good for you to join us. There you are. And let's just go ahead and open it up for questions and discussions by anybody before we head out. If you've got questions for us, please feel free to ask. So there is an open question. What is the deadline for stakeholder responses to be considered for inclusion and the results in meeting 5 and in the final IRP results?
My speaker is on, I believe, and I'm unmuted.
Yeah, you're on, Rahul. Rahul, you're. So Bob or Rahul, did you hear the question?
I did not, Stuart. I
Okay,
apologize.
sorry, I'll repeat it. When is the deadline for stakeholder responses to be considered for inclusion in meeting 5 and in the final IRP results?
We don't, Bob, you also chime in, please. We don't have a final deadline. I'll tell you the process, Stuart. We're gonna, as soon as we start finishing some of the related studies like solar integration and the reserve margin study, we'll start uploading that information. So I think as stakeholders absorb it, if you provide us that information, I think January, February will be very intense analytical months, and probably March. The sooner you get it to us, the better. I think, and Bob, you please, you have to run the process. But I would say that if it comes to early March and we don't have input, it will become hard to incorporate this in the analytics. Would you agree with that, Bob?
I'll speak through your speaker so we don't have to split that report. I would agree, Raul. It just makes perfect sense that we will consider what's provided as it's made available, but we will reach a point in time where it will be impossible to consider comments in the final IRP filing. We have to have a significant period of time for actually turning the crank to get model results produced and the IRP document prepared.
We'll do our best to accommodate with the time we have, Stuart.
Okay, so let's make sure we get that deadline posted to them. And then there's another open question I think that is probably good to ask now from Chris. Regarding the resource needs slide that says Santee Cooper needs approximately 1,650 megawatts of firm capacity needs. How are variable generation resources and demand side management able to contribute to meeting winter peak? Would your model run in the no new fossil scenario require the entire gap to be filled by firm BESS?
Short answer, no. We will be simulating the level of energy efficiency in DR that is being evaluated as part of the MPS studies, incremental as resources within the evaluation. We already incorporate non-firm loads, interruptible loads, direct load control, et cetera, within our current simulations that we're evaluating. So all of those factors will be captured within the load that has to be served. We already have a fairly significant number of megawatts that are factored as dispatchable interruptible load within the simulation model.
Okay, great. And then Justin and Finley both have their hands up. So Justin.
Yes, thank you. In terms of the deadline, and I totally respect and understand that you need comments back to incorporate into your feedback. But let's say we're getting close to that March deadline, and some of these studies that you are creating on your end, whether it's the ELCC, reserve margin, market studies, is there a way you can develop a non-disclosure agreement for us to provide comments while they're still in development so that our feedback can be incorporated in before the actual final application is submitted to the PSC? I know Dominion, we just signed NDAs to get early inputs from them as well this week. It seems a practice that is done fairly common in the state. We just want to make sure that our input is actually met timely if it's running up against your deadlines.
Justin, that's fair. I think what we'll do is that let us as I mentioned, the reserve margin study, we are hoping to upload within days, right? So you'll have that information with all the related detail, and we'll follow that up pretty quickly with the solar integration study. So that's not a month away. It's coming pretty quickly. You review that, and all stakeholders should look at it, and then we will address if there's information that's not in there that requires an NDA, and we'll do that on a case-by-case basis as needed. Is that responsive?
No, it is responsive. I just think from, to really make this stakeholder engagement fully worthwhile, it's about having our inputs incorporated before we get to the actual litigation at the PSC. So that just helps us get there. So that's all the point is, but thank you. That is responsive.
Yes,
Yeah,
we will get that
that's
information uploaded.
Yeah. Finley?
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Finley, yes.
Hey, Raul. Hey, could you just review as much as you can about the status of the potential joint development resource? Sort of just set the, just get us all on the same page here in this group. I mean, there's been a couple questions in the chat. I think you've sort of answered piecemeal some questions that Eddie's had and some questions that I've had and others. Could you just sort of lay out, what you can share right now, where you're at in the process, just to sort of clear the air on that issue as much as you can?
Yes, sure, Finley. I think the reason you feel it's piecemeal is because that process has just started. I have, we have an MOU that we, I believe, executed last week. So the evaluation is yet to begin. I think, as you know, that's, Santee Cooper has expressed in its board meetings and public settings that if supported by this IRP, we build a combined cycle, and if that happens, there are significant economies of scale. So just to position ourselves for capturing those economies of scale, we have begun this process. So I think now the next steps will be, now that the MOU is in place, for the two teams to engage and figure out transmission implications, fuel access. And so we are in very, very early stages of that. So our goal would be to make progress by the time we get to the IRP submission process and capture as much as we can at that time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Chris, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I was going to say one additional item that I think would be helpful in terms of strengthening the stakeholder input process would be an opportunity for Santee Cooper to indicate to stakeholders how they have responded to stakeholder input before the filing of the IRP with the Public Service Commission.
Sorry, could you say that again? I'm not sure I followed.
Sure, I was saying something that could strengthen the process would be if Santee Cooper could reply to stakeholders once stakeholders give input and Santee Cooper evaluates it. If Santee Cooper could reply to stakeholders, kind of responding to the feedback before the filing.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good input. Okay, and then Rahul and Bob, there's a follow-up from Ben Garris that I think might be good to weigh in on before we close the meeting. And this is, I'll just read the.
That's okay, Stuart. I've actually already read it, and I think the response. So
beat me to it.
Yeah, Ben, I would say you're looking. I'm assuming you're looking for, have we performed specific economic or other planning assumptions, generation, building and planning assumptions regarding the retirement of crops. I don't have the question in front of me, so I'm going to paraphrase. It seems like what you're looking for is what studies have been prepared so that we determine that we've got a 2034 retirement date of crops. I can,
Yeah,
I can
and
tell you
Ben,
that.
Ben, your mic is available. You could, if we're not getting it right, feel free to turn on your mic and
And I can tell you, I think Eileen answered it as succinctly as possible, Ben. We do not have an independent study that says optimally the unit ought to be retired on this date. What we have is a current plan to retire Winya by 2029. We recognize in all practical application, it's going to be difficult to get 4,000 megawatts of new capacity on the system within any short period of time. So we adopted a reasonable 5-year plan between Winya and cross retirements for purposes of evaluation. We're hoping that by looking at those retirement dates, we'll be able to clearly understand whether it's in Santee Cooper's best interest to retire cross or not. And hopefully with some side cases, understand whether an accelerated or delayed date for that retirement might be more advisable.
okay, thanks, Ben. So he thanked us for the response, Bob. I think you got it. Good. All right. So other questions, comments people would like to make, feel free to raise your hand. Chris and then Thomas.
Thanks. I was wondering, Bob, could you repeat what you said earlier about, did I hear you say that you feel like you have a solid grasp on the inputs for renewables in terms of pricing?
I feel like we've got a pretty good grasp on the solar and the battery. I would suggest that the wind is still under review. Keep in mind that we are evaluating, Chris, assumptions that are directly derived from the NREL ATB. So the source that we're using for capital and O&M costs, any one of us on this call could go out to the NREL website, download their modeled assumptions and identify the cost related assumptions that we're assuming.
I gotcha. Okay, thank you. I was going to suggest that, given I fully understand and I fully understand that there's some serious uncertainties about, tax credit applicability and kind of, just other funding opportunities through the Inflation Reduction Act, given its newness and how it's, actively being implemented by the federal government. However, I think a lot of the implementation and guidance should be out from IRS and Treasury Department, in short order within weeks. So I would suggest that, rather than kind of assuming a blanket assumption of a 30% ITC, it could make sense to, just keep that assumption open for when the, guidance comes out to look at what might be available to Santee Cooper. Or alternately, maybe doing a sensitivity where, it could be a 30% ITC, but it could be a 50 or 60% ITC, just depending on the circumstances. And then also with the PTC also.
We'll certainly keep our eyes out on those relative assumptions. I think the industry in general, if as you're suggesting, we'd all love to have a codified set of rules and implementation from the Treasury. I know that they've been piecemealing out a little bit of guidance in the Department of Energy here and there. So we certainly will keep our eyes open. I will say that we will reach a point where we've kind of got to cut things off. I think future conditions will always be in a state of potential implementation and flux, but we will have to make a judgment call on the best assumptions that we can utilize as of a certain date. As Raul indicated, that could be in the late February, March timeframe, where we really have to kind of say, okay, these are our final baked in assumptions, and we're going to turn the crank and produce some results for the IRP at that point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thomas? Unfortunately, it says you're using an older version of Zoom, and I'm not sure, but I don't think I can. I can't unfortunately, I can't unlock you. Peter, do you see an opportunity to?
I've got the same message, Stuart. You have to upgrade the
Yeah,
software.
I'm sorry. I can't I can't undo your microphone, Thomas. I apologize. It's a technology issue. Sorry. Feel free to type a question. I'm so sorry. I really am. Other comments or questions? I know Jonathan's working on an answer to John. So before we close out, and I know that you know, several of you are in a desire to move on to your final meetings for the day. Just well, why don't we go ahead to the next page? So hopefully we've answered your questions today. If we haven't, you know, by all means, or if new questions come up, feel free to send them into the forum. You can certainly any comments or feedback for Vanry or my team on how we facilitated the meeting. Feel free to send them directly to me. That's my email there. And then the meeting summaries and other materials will be posted and made available to the IRP. As you close out, you should be getting a request to complete the survey. We really would appreciate you doing that. It only takes a couple of minutes to do that. And we do review the feedback, and hopefully you see that we've been tuning meetings as we go. You know, trying to respond, trying to make the meetings better and more valuable for you as the stakeholder. So, and Brian, thanks. I see your comment there in the Q&A. Appreciate it. So any feedback that you've got for us, feel free to send it to me about the meetings. Send it to me directly. And please definitely fill out the survey. And we look forward to seeing what the results are and communicating with you all further. And with that, if there are no other questions, thank you all. You all have been great. It's been wonderful. You know, I don't know if you've noticed, but it's close to 100 with all the follow-up questions, close to 100 questions that we've been able to get through, and quite a bit of material. You've been a great group of stakeholders. We really appreciate working with you. And look forward to
Stuart, this is Rahul. I also, on behalf of Santee Cooper, wanted to express my my gratitude to everybody who participated and spent their afternoon with us. I was monitoring all the activity on the chat box, and it was very enlightening. Some good ideas. The links were shared, and we will be reviewing that. So really appreciate the
great group of
dialogue. Thank you.
stakeholders. They've been you know, asking really good questions and furthering the conversation. So we really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, and I'll just keep the meeting open until the questions are closed out. But thank you all. We appreciate your time.